Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, by Ronald McNair Scott. Part 3, 1314 to 1329. After the aforesaid victory, Robert the Bruce was commonly called King of Scotland by all men, because he had acquired Scotland by force of arms. Chronicle of Lanarcost. Chapter 14. The whole realm of Scotland, with the exception of Berwick, now lay in the hands of Robert Bruce, and no king of Scots, before or since, has a greater knowledge from his own experience of the character and condition of his people, from the feudal aristocracy, with whom he had been brought up at court and tournaments, to the humblest serf, in whose hovel he had found shelter when a fugitive from his foes. Whatever had been the driving force of his career at its outset, a desire for personal aggrandizement or patriotism, or a compound of them both, Scotland was now in his charge, and he would labor for her welfare. For her prosperity he needed peace, for her dignity the recognition of her independence and her chosen king, for her spiritual comfort the removal of the papal interdict. Throughout the remainder of his reign, his whole policy was governed by his determination to achieve these ends. He had no wish to prolong the war. He saw his victory, above all, as an opportunity for reconciliation with the Scottish nobles who had fought against him, with the English whom he had defeated. Soon after Bannockburn, many Scottish barons and knights who had served under the two Edwards offered to him their allegiance and were received into his peace. In November 1314, a parliament convened at Cambus-Kenneth, and judged that all Scottish landowners who had failed to do so by that date should be disinherited, but Bruce treated this as an enabling statute only and granted a year's grace before enforcing disposition. His sole proviso was that those who wished to regain their Scottish lands must do homage to him alone. They could no longer be feudatories in two countries and serve two kings. They must choose their nationality once and for all, a decisive break for the multinational feudal system that had hitherto prevailed. In the event, the great majority became his subjects, and with few exceptions served him faithfully. He was less successful in his relations with England. In the immediate aftermath of Bannockburn, he had returned unasked to Edward II, the Great Seal of England, and the Royal Shield, which had been captured in the battle, in the hope that this gesture of amity might elicit a statesmanlike response from the English king. But Edward II had been too humiliated by his defeat in shameful fight, and too conditioned by his father to abhor the Scots, to rise above a petulant childishness when dealing with that race. The opportunity to restore the amicable relations which had existed between his grandfather and Alexander III, and which could have prevented 400 years of strife between the two nations, was ignored. He made no concession to Bruce's overture, and soon after was embroiled with the four earls, Lancaster, Warwick, Surrey, and Arundel, who had absented themselves from his invasion and was virtually deprived of his executive powers. Bruce had no alternative but to try to obtain by force what was denied to civility. His troops, who were filled with that elation which comes to those who had fought in war and against all odds have foiled their enemy, were impatient for action. In August 1314, under Edward Bruce, James Douglas and John Soulis, great-nephew of the guardian of that name, they were let loose to sweep through Northumberland, County Durham, and into Yorkshire, as far south as Richmond, exacting tribute and gathering spoil, and backed by Cumberland burning Brough, Appleby, and Kirkwood on their way. In December of the same year, Bruce himself carried out a second raid along the Tyne Valley, occupying Haltwhistle, Hexham, and Corbridge, resuming the lordship of Tyndale, which had formerly belonged to Alexander III, receiving from the men of that area a down payment for a truce to midsummer 1315, and their feudal homage to him as their lord. Early in 1315, yet a third raid was mounted under James Douglas and Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, driving deep into County Durham and sacking Hartlepool. The northern English, unsupported by their king, were completely demoralized and made no resistance. 100 English, wrote their chronicler Walsingham, describing the state of their mind after Bannockburn, would not hesitate to fly from 2 or 3 Scottish soldiers, so grievously had their wonted courage deserted them. But however useful were the droves of cattle and ransom moneys to Bruce for the needs of his kingdom, he realized that these raids in no way shook the structure of England. The wealth of the country, its shipping, trade, industry, manpower, and food production were all in the South and Midlands. The northern counties, pastoral, sparsely populated, remote from the centres of government, could temporarily be sacrificed without halting the pulse of the country, provided that the great fortresses of Carlisle, Berwick, and Norham remained in English hands as bases for recovery. To bring his enemy to terms, the Scottish king needed to strike in a more sensitive area, and it was this consideration that determined him to open a second front in Ireland. Throughout the 13th century, there had been a great surge forward in the prosperity and settled habitation of that country under the Anglo-Norman conquerors. But during the wars of Scottish independence, Edward I had made it one of the main sources of supply for his army in Scotland. Irish troops were responsible for much of the western marches, and Irish ships for the provisioning of the Galloway castles. By the end of his reign, the forces and exchequer of Ireland had been so denuded by his demands that its Lord Lieutenant could no longer prevent the spread of lawlessness and disorder. Edward II made several half-hearted attempts to repair these deficiencies, but once again the requirements of his armies against Scotland caused him to claw back more than he had supplied, and the situation grew worse. His defeat at Bannockburn by a mainly Celtic army roused the expectation of his subject Celts. The recovery of their independence no longer seemed a chimera. Taking advantage of this new mood, Bruce, early in 1315, sent envoys to Ireland carrying with them the following message. The king sends greetings to all the kings of Ireland, to the prelates and clergy, and to the inhabitants of all Ireland, his friends. Whereas we and you, and our people and your people, free since ancient times, share the same national ancestry, and are urged to come together more eagerly and joyfully, in friendship, by a common language and by a common custom, we have sent over to you our beloved kinsmen, the bearers of this letter, to negotiate with you in our name about permanently strengthening and maintaining inviolate the special friendship between us and you, so that with God's will your nation may be able to recover her ancient liberty. Whatever our envoys or one of them may conclude with you in this matter, we shall ratify and uphold in future. A desired response came from the O'Neills, the royal line of Ulster, who sent emissaries to Robert Bruce, asking for military aid against the English and offering the throne of Ireland to his brother Edward. The moment was propitious. Throughout his career, Robert Bruce had maintained close links with the men of Ulster, and was well aware of the disintegrating state of the country. From the strategic point of view, a friendly Ireland, offering a base from which to threaten the west of England or to combine with an insurrection of the Welsh, could provide a powerful bargaining counter against the English. From the personal point of view, it would be a welcome relief if the savage energy of his brother could be afforded employment at a distance, for his jealous ambition was already threatening the tranquillity of the state. According to one chronicler, he had declared that Scotland was too small to contain both Bruces, and according to another, that he could not live in peace with his brother unless he was granted a sole rule of half the kingdom. Bruce had gone some way to soothe his discontent. In April 1315, a parliament was held at Ayr to consider the succession to the throne. Separated from his wife for 8 years, Bruce had no legitimate son. His heir presumptive was his daughter Marjorie, about 20 years old, recently returned from England, and soon after betrothed and married to Walter Stewart. On the grounds that the continuing peril from England demanded an experienced man at the head of affairs, Marjorie, on her father's advice, agreed to waive her rights as heir in favor of her uncle Edward. Described in the entail as a man, strenuous and skilled in the arts of war, if Robert Bruce should die without a legitimate male heir, the crown should pass first to Edward, then to his heirs male, then, failing these, to Marjorie and her heirs. If the succession fell to a minor, Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, was to act as regent. At the same Parliament, the appeal from Ireland was considered, and a decision was taken to send there an expeditionary force under the command of Edward Bruce. No man was readier for action. He was one who, like the hero of the Chanson de Gusty, would have declared, "If I had one foot in paradise, I would withdraw it to go and fight." Now his craving for the clash of steel and the glitter of a crown could be satisfied in full, while, at the same time, he would be carrying out the strategic objective of his royal brother, to harass England in her most vulnerable quarter. So important was this to the Scottish king that he put at Edward's disposal 6,000 veteran soldiers, and, knowing the headstrong and reckless character of his brother, designated to accompany him Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, on whose combination of judgment and courage he could rely. On the 26th of May, 1315, the Scots landed at Larne, near Carrickfergus, in Ulster. Within a month of their landing, they defeated the Anglo-Irish barons of Ulster at Moray Pass in Armagh, and, after concluding a truce with the defenders of Carrickfergus Castle, drove south to Dundalk, and on the 29th of June, 1315, put the inhabitants to the sword. Taking advantage of the dissensions between the Anglo-Irish leaders, they defeated piecemeal the Earl of Ulster at Conar on the 10th of September, 1315. Roger Mortimer at Kinellis at the end of December, and on the 1st of February, 1316, routed Edmund Butler, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, at the Battle of Skerries and Kildare. The road to Dublin was open, but the devious behavior of the native Irish chieftains who, on 2 occasions by treachery, involved the Scots in situations from which they extricated themselves with difficulty, decided Edward Bruce to retrace his steps to Carrickfergus to capture the castle and make certain of the base from which he could maintain his supply line to Scotland. Once again his success in open warfare was almost annulled by deceit. While investing the castle, he agreed with the governor that a truce should be observed over the Holy Week of Easter, so that men might spend their time in penance and prayer. But on the night of Easter Eve, 15 ships from Dublin, loaded with armed men under the command of Sir Thomas Mandeville, slipped into the bay and entered the castle by a seaward gate. The Scots, with no thought of treason, were scattered about the countryside, or in lodgings in the town below, leaving only Neil Fleming and 60 men to watch the castle gate, which fronted on the town. At first light, the garrison of the castle and their newly arrived reinforcements let down the drawbridge and broached upon the unsuspecting Scots. When Neil Fleming saw them, he sent a messenger in haste to warn Edward Bruce, and when with his little band pressed forward to hold the enemy at bay, and fought them hand to hand until all his company were killed. The respite occasioned by this defence gave Edward Bruce and the 12 knights who were in his quarters enough time to arm and make for the battle with their followers. As soon as they joined the melee, they drove towards Sir Thomas Mandeville, and, one of them felling him on the ground with his axe, Edward turned him over and dispatched him with his dagger. Meanwhile the scattered Scots, as fast as they could arm, hurried to the fray, some to the castle gate and some to the ships, until their opponents, disheartened by the death of their leader, fled back within the castle walls. When the fighting was over, Edward Bruce looked among the fallen for Neil Fleming. He found him scarce alive, and with his followers in a heap on either side. He stayed by him until he died, and at his death he wept. In all his life, this was only the second time he had been known to weep. 3 weeks later, at Dundalk on the 2nd of May, 1316, Edward Bruce was crowned High King of all Ireland. A crucial factor in the success which had attended the Scottish invasion of Ireland was control of the narrow seas between the two countries. In the summer of 1314, while Bruce was engaged in the defence of his country against England, John of Lorne, who after his defeat at the pass of Brander had been appointed by Edward II Admiral of the Western Seas, landed on the Isle of Man and ousted the Scottish garrison. From there he began to canvass the petty chieftains of the Outer Isles and the sea-going men of Argyll to form a maritime opposition to the Scottish king. Bruce was not slow to realize the danger to his strategy, As soon as the ships had been transported, Edward Bruce and his army to Ireland had returned. He made an expedition to the Western Isles, accompanied by his son-in-law, Walter Stewart. Sailing up Loch Fern, he bypassed the long beat around the Mull of Kintyre by laying pine trees side by side across the narrow neck of land which separates the lochs of East and West Harbet, and taking his ship over them partly by manpower and partly by hoisting their sails to catch the strong wind that blew from the east. So unexpectedly did he break into the open sea beyond that the men of the Isles recall the ancient prophecy that whoever should sail across the isthmus should have domination over them. One by one they came to do him homage. John of Lorne was left without supporters, and retired to England, impotent in body, and his lands in Scotland totally destroyed, there to receive a pension from Edward II until his death in 1318. A swarm of island privateers, under the protection of the Scottish king, now threatened the coastal towns of England, and the merchantmen who plied between them and Ireland. Chief of these marauders was Thomas Doon, who on the 12th of September 1315, with 4 Flemish sea captains and sailed into Holyhead, captured an English ship, and overwed the island of Anglesey. A rumor spread that Edward Bruce was about to cross from Ireland and restore the ancient liberties of Wales, and the Welsh rose in revolt under Llewellyn Bren. Edward II had to countermand the Welsh levies, who had been summoned to join the army. He was preparing against Scotland, and when the French king requested the aid of the English navy against the Flemings, he had to reply that all its ships were required for the defense of Ireland. So far, Bruce's strategy was proving successful. The English were too occupied in dealing with their Celtic subjects to reinforce their northern strongpoints, and gave an opportunity to Bruce to attack them. On the 22nd of July, 1315, after ravaging the surrounding districts and driving in the cattle to feed the army, he laid siege to Carlisle. For the first time, the Scots had been to acquire and bring with them siege artillery, but their single stone lobbing machine was no match for the 8 employed by the defenders. The high tower they proposed to wheel up to the walls sank in the swampy ground before it reached its objective. The shelter they built to protect the sappers, while they undermined the fortifications, suffered the same fate. Nor under the hail of arrows from the battlements could they fill the moat with sufficient bundles of brushwood to form a causeway. In a last attempt to win success, Bruce reverted to the element of surprise. On the 30th of July, he assaulted the eastern side of the city with the greater part of his army, while James Douglas, with a picked force of nimble men, set up exceptionally long ladders against the western wall, where the height and difficulty of access was regarded as adequate defense. But the garrison contained a large contingent of archers, and when the first assailants were observed in that quarter, they directed their fire and picked off all who appeared above the parapet. The Scots had been foiled. On the 1st of August, Bruce cut his losses and returned to Scotland, leaving his siege equipment behind. This was the first English success for a number of years, and the governor of Carlisle, Andrew Harclay, received 1,000 marks from Edward II as a mark of his appreciation. 6 months later, Bruce and Douglas made a surprise attack on Berwick on a black night in January 1316, but the moon came out as they approached the uncompleted wall by the harbour, and they were repulsed. Nevertheless, the inhabitants were in a precarious situation. The Scottish fleet was cutting off supplies. From the autumn of 1315, a stream of letters were sent to the English king, complaining that men were dying of starvation, and that even the horses were being eaten. In February 1316, a party of the defenders, under the king's sergeant-at-arms, Sir Raymond de Colon, a Gascon knight, against the orders of the governor, went foraging throughout Teviotdale, saying that it was better to die fighting than to starve. News was brought to Douglas in Selkirk Forest that there was only a handful of skirmishers rustling cattle, and he set out after them with the few men he had about him. When he came up with them at Scathmore, he found that there were a vastly greater number of knights and their followers than his own, but it was not in his nature to turn back. It was, he said afterwards, the hardest fight he never fought. but he won it by concentrating his attack on the enemy commander. His little bunch hewed their way to close quarters with Sir Raymond, and when Douglas dispatched him hand to hand, the rest lost heart and fled. The fugitives from this encounter excused their flight from so small a force by ascribing it to the demonic power of the Black Douglas, a Northumberland baron, Sir Robert Neville, whose character was encapsulated in his sobriquet, the Peacock of the North. Provoked by these reports of the invincible valors of the Scottish knight, challenged him, at his peril, to appear before the walls of Berwick. Douglas immediately marched into that neighborhood, shattered Sir Robert's forces, slew him with his own hand, and took his 3 brothers prisoner. The considerable ransom he received to return for their freedom went to defray the expense of the hunting lodge he was having built at Lintail in the forest of Jedburgh. While these activities were taking place, Bruce had returned to his family. His daughter Marjorie was expecting a child in the spring. This was a matter of some moment, as his own wife, Queen Elizabeth, had not conceived since her return from England. On the 2nd of March 1316, when near her time, Princess Marjorie was thrown from her horse and killed. The surgeons who were sent for, conscious of the succession, at once cut open her abdomen and delivered a son from her dead body. Crippled throughout his life from the injury of his birth, the boy, 54 years later, became King of Scots as Robert II, the first of the royal line of Stuarts. When the obsequies of his daughter were over, the king in person, hearing that a muster of an English army was in train, led a raid in force deep into Yorkshire. By midsummer he had reached Richmond, into whose castle the nobles and gentlemen of the surrounding country had ridden for refuge. They offered a very large sum to be left unharmed, which he accepted. He then turned west, leaving a trail of pillage for 60 miles, into the Furness district of Lancashire. There he laid his hands on the accumulated stock of iron ore, and had it brought by captives to Scotland, where it was in short supply. 3 months after his return, Randolph came to him from Ulster with the news that Carrickfergus Castle had fallen, and that Edward Bruce was only waiting for the arrival of his royal brother, with further troops, to complete the conquest of Ireland. To the end of his life, Bruce remained sensitive to the danger from Ireland if it was in unfriendly hands. For him, the short sea passage between Ulster and his vulnerable western seaboard was a boundary to be protected, no less than the borders themselves. If now there was an opportunity to break the power of the English in Ireland, he was prepared to take a calculated risk. A secure base had been established. He had confidence in Randolph's judgment. An attack on Scotland from the south, while Edward II and the Earl of Lancaster were at loggerheads, could be discounted. Leaving James Douglas and Walter Stewart as regents of his kingdom, he crossed to Carrickfergus in the autumn of 1316 at the head of a considerable army. There was an ancient custom that whoever became High King of Ireland should make a royal progress through all the provinces of Ulster, Meath, Leinster, Munster, and Connaught. To conform to this usage, and thereby stamp the legitimacy of Edward Bruce's coronation on the minds of the native Irish chieftains, and win their adherence, it was decided that the 2 brothers should make their way with their whole host through Ireland and from one end to the other. In February 1317, they left their base at Carrickfergus, moving south in 2 divisions, Edward Bruce commanding the van and Robert the rear. Almost at the outset, the impetuosity of Edward nearly brought disaster. The Anglo-Irish barons under the Red Earl of Ulster had hidden their men in an ambush along the route. Edward, who by then had pushed recklessly ahead without maintaining contact with his brother, they let pass by and prepared to take the rear guard by surprise. But 2 archers, stepping from the woods to fire at Robert's men, alerted the king to the possibility of a trap, and he ordered his troops to halt and take up fighting in formations. His nephew, Colin Campbell, with youthful enthusiasm, started to charge toward the archers. He was quickly overtaken by his uncle, who gave him a resounding buffet that made him reel in the saddle, and a sharp rebuke for disobeying orders. It was well that he had been checked, for within minutes hundreds of the enemy came out of the woods, on either side greatly outnumbering the Scots. It was the bitterest encounter in all the Irish War, and if Bruce's military instinct had not caused him to marshal his men in time, they must have been overwhelmed. Not for nothing had he been named one of the 3 greatest knights in Christendom. This time he was in the thick of the fight, with Ronald, scarcely less renowned, and other tried companions beside him, and a body of veteran soldiers. He gradually gained the ascendancy, and although they were 8-1 against the Scots, it was the Anglo-Irish who gave the order to retreat and make in haste for Dublin. Their arrival there roused the inhabitants to a frenzy of activity. For months they had been demanding the authorities to put the defenses of the city in order. Now, with the knowledge that the Scots were only 8 miles away, they took matters into their own hands. They clapped the defeated Earl in gaol as a traitor, set fire to the suburbs of wooden houses, burnt the bridges across the Liffey, and tore down the belfry of St. Mary's Church to provide stones to repair the breaches in the walls. Their spirited defense had its effect. As Bruce watched the flames rising around the city from his camp at Castleknock, he doubted, after the losses he had suffered, that he had the men or the time to succeed in the siege against the resolute opponents. He had with him one of the Irish chieftains, Brian Ban of O'Brien, whose clan was powerful in the southwest. O'Brien promised that if the king rode into Munster, there would be a general uprising in his favour, so Bruce decided to bypass Dublin, march south by Naas, and Kildare, and Callan, and Kilkenny, ravaging the lands of the Anglo-Irish on the way, and then turn west toward Limerick. But when the Scots reached the Shannon hoping to effect a junction with the whole Irish army at Sangreal, they were grievously disappointed, as happened more than once throughout the campaign. Clan feuds overrode the Irish desire to be free of the English yoke. Brian O'Brien's clan rival was Morog O'Brien. Automatically, he supported the opposite side, and when Bruce reached the river, Morog's army of Thomond was mustered on the farther bank, with intent to strike. Bruce was already anxious about his expedition. The great European famine of 1315-17 had spread to Ireland and was at its worst in the southwest. Even without clan quarrels, the rallying of Irish chieftains for concerted action was virtually impossible while famine gripped their domains. News, too, had reached him that Sir Roger Mortimer, newly created Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, was consolidating the forces raised by his predecessor, Edmund Butler, in Cork and Waterford, to cut off his return to his Ulster base. He gave the order for retreat. The troops were ready to set off when he heard a woman's shriek. Asking the reason for this, he was told that it was the cry of a laundress who is in the pangs of childbirth and must be left behind. At this he halted his army, saying that no woman in such a state should be deserted, and he gave orders that a tent should be pitched and that other women should stay beside her until her child was born, and that arrangements should be made for mother and child to be carried with the troops. Only when this was done did he give the order to move. Their journey north was a long and painful progress through famine and plague-stricken lands, with the horses weakening from lack of forage or killed to provide food for the soldiers. As they crossed the boglands of County Tipperary, they were harassed by Edmund Butler and his levies, and everywhere along the route they were pestered by the starving Irish peasants who had been reduced to cannibalism. When they reached Trim in County Meath, they rested for 4 days. The Ulster border was only 30 miles away. Here at last was the first flush of spring grass for the remaining horses and food for the men, so the gaunt and ragged band could pull itself into shape and march into Ulster as soldiers who had completed a mission. It was time for Robert Bruce to return to his kingdom. Leaving many of his men with his brother Edward, he sailed for Scotland with the Earl of Moray while the passage of the seas was still open, landing late in the month of May 1317. As soon as it had been known in England that Bruce was intending to join his brother in Ireland, Edward II and the Earl of Lancaster, representing the Lords Ordainers, agreed to mount an invasion of Scotland, but the relations between them were not conducive to efficiency. According to a contemporary, whatever pleases the Lord King, the Earl's servants try to upset, and whatever pleases the Earl, the King's servants call treachery, and so The lords by whom the land ought to be defended are not allowed to be of one accord. In the event, the Earl of Lancaster and the barons of his party assembled their forces at Newcastle in October 1316 to await the arrival of the king, but the king had not forgotten Lancaster's refusal to join him in 1314, and took his revenge by failing to appear. The Earl of Lancaster returned home in dudgeon, and the troops were disbanded. The Earl of Arundel, however, hearing that James Douglas was to hold a housewarming on the completion of his hunting lodge at Lintail in the forest of Jedburgh, gathered together his followers, each armed with a wood axe, and with a number of other knights and esquires who wished for action, set out, several thousand strong, with the intention of cutting down the forest and destroying the lodge. But Douglas had enough warning of their coming to muster 50 mounted men and a great body of archers, for which that part of the country was famous. At one point on their line of march, the English had to pass between two woods, which converged together to form a bottleneck. When he knew the enemy was near, Douglas placed his archers in ambush in a hollow on one side, and his mounted men at the far end, and planted the young birch trees along the edges of the ride, so that it was difficult for a horse to break through. Then, as the English closed together to enter the narrowing way, and had almost reached its end, he gave his war cry of "Douglas, Douglas!" The archers poured their arrows into the crowded flanks of the English cavalry, and Douglas and his horsemen charged them head-on, with such force that the leading knights were bowled over and their horses, struggling and kicking, and those behind which had been brought down by the hail of arrows, created such confusion that the English turned back into the open space behind and fled in panic. Their van had been led by Sir Thomas Richmond, whose custom it was to wear a fur hat around his helmet. He was borne down at the first onslaught, and before he could rise, Douglas had jumped from his horse, slain him with his dagger, and taken his fur hat to wear as a token. 300 of the enemy had missed their route and unexpectedly came across Douglas's new lodge. Finding it unoccupied, but with provisions all ready for his feast, they sat down to eat, thinking that he would be too much engaged elsewhere to disturb them, but his success had been so swift that he came back among them while they were still at table, and few survived. Another party of English knights who, after the disbanding of the army at Newcastle, sought action against the Scots, took ship and sailed north into the Firth of Forth. The sheriff of that area, when he saw the ships approaching, gathered a force of 500 men, and as the ship sailed along the coast, kept pace with them on the shore to prevent them landing. But the ships beached at Inverkeithing, near Dunfermline, before they could come up with them and disembark so many knights that the defenders, seeing them in formation, lost heart and began to stream away inland. William Sinclair, Bishop of Dunkeld, with 60 horsemen, met them as they fled. He asked the sheriff what was their hurry. The sheriff replied that the English had landed in such force that they could not oppose them. At this, the bishop, after saying contemptuously that he should have the gilt spurs hewed from his heels for such cowardice, called out, "Let him who loves this king and country turn smartly and follow me." With that he cast off his bishop's robe, beneath which he was in armor, and seizing a stout spear rode toward the enemy. The Scots, shamed into action, drew up behind him. When they neared the English, the bishop, who was a big and mighty man, cried out, "Now spur your horses, men, and we shall override them." And like an avalanche, they charged the opposing ranks and scattered them in confusion. Many went down before the Scottish spears, and others retreating to the ships crowded the nearest so thickly that they overturned, and all were drowned. When Bruce was later told of how the bishop saved the day, he took him in his arms and called him ever after, "My own bishop." The failure of his armed forces decided Edward II to enlist the weapons of spiritual warfare. His opportunity now arose. Pope Clement V, his country's friend, had died soon after Bannockburn. For 2 years the Electoral College had been unable to agree on a successor. At last, in August 1316, the choice had fallen on John XXII, a French man from the English fief of Guienne. The abiding ambition of the new pope was to launch a crusade against the infidel. The English envoys at his holy see in Avignon, in the absence of any Scottish representatives, who were debarred by the wholesale excommunication pronounced by his predecessor, easily persuaded him that only the obduracy of the Scots prevented them from offering the whole of their military might for the recovery of Jerusalem. Accordingly, he issued the bull Volcatis Nobis, commanding a 2-year truce between Scotland and England, and sent a powerful embassy to London under the Cardinals Guacchini and Lucca to see that the papal instructions were delivered to both parties. The cardinals arrived in the autumn of 1317 and handed over to Edward II the sealed letters they had brought with them. At the same time, they dispatched 2 envoys, the Bishop of Corbeil and the Archdeacon of Perpignan, under safe conduct to the Scottish king, with similar letters for her perusal. A confidential report made to their masters on the completion of their mission has an especial interest, for it is only contemporary accounts of the meeting with Robert Bruce in person. From it emerges the portrait of a man of great charm and dignity, calm, assured, with a lively sense of humor and a beguiling courtesy. He received them, they wrote, with smiling affability. No man, he declared, was more anxious to secure a true and lasting peace, nor was more conscious of the Holy Father's benevolence in making efforts to achieve it. But when they handed him the letters, he pointed out that they were addressed to our dearest son in Christ, Edward II, illustrious King of England, and to our dear son, the noble Robert Bruce, acting as King of Scots. There are, he said mildly, several gentlemen in Scotland who have the name of Robert Bruce. It would have been one of these, only if they had been addressed to the King of Scots. Would he have felt sure that they were meant for him, and since they were not, he had no option but to refuse them. The envoys, in some confusion, pleaded that the Holy Father could not employ denominations which committed him to one side or another in a temporal dispute. But that, said the king, is exactly what he has done by depriving me of the title of king, which is acknowledged throughout my realm, and by which I am addressed by foreign rulers. Our father the Pope and our mother the Church of Rome would seem to be showing partiality among their own children. If you had brought letters addressed in this manner to other kings, you might well have received a more savage reply. When they begged him to waive protocol, and in the interest of humanity bring a halt to hostilities, he answered that this was a matter for his parliament, and he could not expect their decision for some time. His tone had remained friendly, but firm throughout the interview. But when they retired from his presence, the forcible expression of his counselors left them in no doubt of the indignation aroused by the insult to their king. They returned therefore to the cardinals, with the sealed letters undelivered, but the cardinals were unwilling to credit the discouraging report of their envoys, and appointed another emissary. The unfortunate man they selected was Adam Newton, superior of the Berwick Franciscans. Well aware of the delicacy of the situation, he prudently left the papal communications at his friary until he should be confirmed of a safe conduct. After a hazardous journey, he found the King of Scots in a wood near Old Cambus, a hamlet some 12 miles from Berwick, busily engaged in preparing siege engines for an assault on that city. Newton obtained a safe conduct from Sir Alexander Seton, the king's deputy seneschal, returned to Berwick for his papers, and once more made his way to Old Cambus. He was refused a royal interview, but his letters were delivered to the king, who, observing that they were still not addressed to the King of Scotland, had them handed back with the brusque rejoinder that so long as his royal titles were withheld, he would accept no truce, but would make himself master of Berwick. Fearful of the fury of his superiors, the friar nerved himself to declare in public, before a gathering of barons and their followers, that the Pope demanded an instant application of a truce. A menacing growl of anger greeted his pronouncement, and he was with difficulty hustled away from the place in order to find his own way home. His troubles had not ended. On his road to Berwick, he was waylaid by 4 armed ruffians, robbed of his papal documents, among which were bulls excommunicating the King of Scotland, stripped of his clothes and sent naked on his way. "It is rumored," he wrote in a letter addressed to the cardinals, "that the papers entrusted me are now in the possession of King Robert." The failure of the papal efforts and the news of the Scottish preparations against Berwick determined Edward II to order a mobilization for the protection of that town, but he was forestalled by Bruce. For some time, the citizens of Berwick and the military had been at odds. In June 1317, Edward II received a complaint that the commandant was defrauding the treasury by drawing double pay for his retinue, starving the garrison, committing peculations in stores, and totally neglecting the king's interest. In consequence, Edward handed over the control of the town's defenses to the mayor and burgesses to be administered on an annual grant of 6,000 marks. Inevitably, disputes arose between soldiers and burgesses. Among the latter, one Peter Spalding was much offended by the insults he received from the military on account of his marriage to a Scotswoman. In revenge, he sent word to Sir Robert Keith, Mareschal of Scotland, to whom his wife was related, that, on a certain date on which it was his turn to keep watch over a section of the wall, he would admit the Scots. Sir Robert took the message direct to the king, who decided to risk the possibility of a trap. Sir Robert was ordered to keep his information secret, and to assemble his men at Duns Park. To him there the king would send James Douglas and Thomas Randolph with a small body of picked men, and only then was he to reveal the plot to the other two leaders. On the night of the 1st of April, 1318, Douglas and Randolph, with their scaling party, left their horses at Duns Park and marched through the darkness to where Spalding was waiting. There they set their ladders and mounted the walls unseen. Their orders were to hold that part of the walls with their main body until Bruce should arrive with reinforcements, but to send a few throughout the town to cause panic. When daylight came, the prospect of plunder proved too great for Douglas and Randolph to be able to restrain their men, who dispersed through the streets pillaging and killing. This almost proved fatal to the enterprise. Many of the citizens escaped to the castle with their arms and swelled the garrison. By noon, the governor of the castle, Roger Horsley, seeing the holding party on the walls reduced to a handful, made a sally with his increased forces and nearly overwhelmed them. Never was the disproportionate effect that could be achieved by veteran champions more clearly shown than on this occasion. Almost single-handed, Douglas and Randolph repelled the attack, ably assisted by a new-made knight, Sir William Keith of Galston, whose name was come down to posterity for his action that day. The English were driven back to the castle. Bruce arrived with his army soon after, secured the town, and within a short time starved the castle garrison into surrender. Conscious of the immense trading value of the greatest seaport in his kingdom, Bruce made an exception from his policy of demolishing all captured fortresses. He repaired and improved the battlements, provisioned the castle with stores for a year, and placed town and castle under the command of his son-in-law, Walter Stewart. Neither he nor his son-in-law had any illusions that the English would allow Berwick to remain undisturbed. Walter Stewart sent for his friends and followers till he had with him, besides archers, spearmen, and crossbowmen, 500 gentlemen who quartered the arms of the Stewart. He enlisted also John Crabbe, a Fleming and an expert in the construction of siege weapons, who assembled for him along the ramparts catapults both large and small for the discharge of huge stones or iron darts, and installed hoses to emit Greek fire. When by May 1317 these precautions had been put in train, Bruce took his army south, captured the castles of Harbottle, Wark, and Mitford, and then drove deep into Yorkshire, burning Northallerton, Boroughbridge, and Knaresborough. Ripon was spared on the promise of 1,000 marks. 6 burgesses were taken as hostages to ensure payment. 2 years later, the unfortunate wives of these men, when the bulk of the debt was still outstanding, petitioned Edward II to compel their fellow citizens to make good their undertaking, so that they could once more enjoy the comfort of their husbands. The plunder from this expedition was very great, especially in terms of livestock. They made men and women captive, says the Lennorcost Chronicle, forcing the poor folk to drive a countless quantity of cattle before them, carrying them off to Scotland without any opposition. The Archbishop of York responded to this incursion into his diocese by proclaiming once more the excommunication of the King of Scots. His opening salvo was followed by a powerful barrage from the Pope. In June 1318, he published a sentence of excommunication not only against Robert Bruce, but all his accomplices. Scotland was placed under an interdict, and in September, it was ordered that in every church throughout England, a service of communion should be held thrice daily, in which curses should be pronounced against Bruce, Douglas, and Randolph. Chapter 15. After the departure of his brother to Scotland in May 1317, Edward Bruce, who could never stay still, became involved in the politics and skirmishes of petty Irish chieftains in an attempt to rally them under his royal standard. His efforts were understandable. By the close of 1316, the English had realized that they must regain control of the Irish seas and cut his lifeline to Scotland. Additional ships were commissioned in December 1316 and May 1317 to join the fleet at Dublin, and on 13th of July 1317, Sir John Athy, with a strengthened naval force, captured Thomas Doon, the Scottish admiral, worsted his ships, and destroyed the ascendancy of the Scots. Reinforcements to Edward Bruce could no longer be assured. Local support had become increasingly important. He was helped in obtaining this by the Mennonite friars and other religious orders, whose activities in the cause of Irish independence played somewhat the same part as their brethren in Scotland. To harness still further the patriotic devotion of the Church, Donald O'Neill, in December 1317, sent a remonstrance of the Holy See, styling himself King of Ulster and true heir by heritable right to all Ireland. He touched on the evil practices of the English, who counted the death of a dog as of more importance than that of an Irishman, and declared that since the kings of Scotland derived their blood from that of Ireland, he was willing to renounce his right to the throne in favor of Edward Bruce. A pious, prudent, and modest man of ancient Irish descent, powerful enough to redeem the Irish from their house of bondage. Few adjectives could be less applicable to Edward Bruce, as he was to demonstrate in his last campaign, in October 1318. When his horses and men were in prime condition after the harvest, he set out with 2,000 Scotsmen and a number of native Irish to attack Dundalk. Newly arrived reinforcements from his brother were to follow. On hearing of his approach, Richard Clare, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, gathered together a force of armed knights, many times greater, and took up his position across the route to the town. Edward Bruce had arranged his men in 3 columns, vanguard, main guard, and rear guard, but had briefed them so badly that none kept contact with their following body. They were strung out at such a distance that the first column was annihilated before the second came up, and then the second before the third. Edward was in command of the third. He had sent before him as scouts 3 veteran soldiers, Sir John Soulis, Sir Philip Mowbray, and Sir John Stewart. When they saw what had happened to the first 2 columns and the greatly superior force of English, they advised their commander to turn back. Edward angrily replied that he would fight were the enemy 3 times as many. "My brother is near at hand with 1,500 men," said Sir John Stewart. "Let us not fight in such haste." And all 3 begged Edward to wait for their arrival. The Irish chiefs offered to delay the advance of the English by sending their men on a series of hit-and-run attacks until Stewart's brother arrived, but were not prepared to take part in an immediate set battle, while the Scottish numbers were inferior. But Edward Bruce would listen to no reason. Headstrong as ever, he flew into a rage and swore that no man, while he lived, should ever say that an enemy had made him give way. To this the Irish coldly replied that in a case they would withdraw their forces and watch the battle from afar. But his 3 knights, true to their code, answered, "So be it then, we shall take what God sends," and went to arm. Edward, with the belated onset of self-preservation, dressed as a simple knight. His royal coat of armor he gave to Gib Harper, a stalwart warrior from his estate, but it was of no avail. At the first onslaught, the pitiful handful of Scots were overwhelmed. Edward Bruce was cut down by Sir John Birmingham. Sir John Soulis, Sir John Stewart, and Gib Harper were slain. Sir Philip Mowbray fell stunned to the ground, but, recovering his senses as he was being dragged away by two of the enemy, broke free and managed to join John Thomas, leader of the men of Carrick, who were retreating with his contingent toward the troops of an Irish chief of his acquaintance. There they were received loyally into safety and made their way back to Carrickfergus. The English searched among the dead for Edward Bruce. Finding Gib Harper in resplendent mail, they thought he was his master, showing little regard for the manners of chivalry which distinguished Robert Bruce after Bannockburn. They quartered his body for public display, and throughout Ireland his head was cut off and salted in a bucket, and in due course was presented by Sir John Berringham to Edward II. In reward, he was created Earl of Louth. The death of Edward Bruce ended the attempt by the Scots to establish a sister regime in Ireland, but their invasion had, to a large extent, achieved the object of Bruce's strategy. The authority of the English government had been shattered. Throughout the remainder of the Middle Ages, it shrunk within the confines of the Pale. The greater part of the island reverted to its customary chaos of feuding kinglets. Never again could it be used by the English as a base from which to mount an attack on the western seaboard of Scotland. Edward Bruce had died without legitimate issue, and thereby rendered irrelevant the 1315 settlement of succession. Accordingly, at a parliament assembled at Scone in December 1318, a fresh act was passed settling the crown, in the event of the king having no legitimate male heir, on his infant grandson Robert Stewart, with Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, again to be regent, and after him Sir James Douglas. Much other legislation was enacted at this parliament, some of it recapitulation of ancient laws for the protection of the church, equal justice to rich and poor, and a close season for salmon. But the majority were innovating reforms for the security of tenants and freeholders, the rights of inheritance, and especially for the calling up and administration of the armed forces. Robert Bruce, with the experience of both English and Scottish armies, his grasp of strategic and tactical consideration, and his awareness of the relative poverty of his country, realized that his military organization must differ from that of England. In broad terms, the English relied on paid foot soldiers and bowmen and a heavily armed cavalry provided partly from the feudal service of magnates, but increasingly in return for pay. Scotland could not afford a paid army, nor obtain from knight service a cavalry of comparable weight. The main deployment of her military must be on foot. Bruce maintained the feudal principle of armed service, but shifted the emphasis. As early as 1309, when granting or regranting tenure, he required from the lessee, instead of the provision of 1 knight, the provision of 10 archers, and continued in this manner in varying degrees from that time on. Unlike the French, whose lack of comprehension caused them to suffer the devastating defeats of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, he understood the efficacy of the long-distance weapon. For his hand-to-hand fighting, he made sure of a national reserve by ordaining in the statutes of the 1318 Parliament that every layman possessing £10 in goods must provide himself with a padded leather jerkin, steel helmet, and gloves of plate, and that small folk having in goods the value of a cow must own a good spear or a good bow and a sheaf of arrows. It was made incumbent on sheriffs to carry out inspections, and, if this law had not been obeyed, to deprive the culprit of his saleable goods, and hand the proceeds half to the king and half to his lawful superior. Determined to knit the whole community together in defense of the country, and knowing too well the discord which can arise between civilians and military from the commandeering habits of the latter, he laid down that all leaders bringing their men to the assembly point of the army should bring adequate provision with them or money to pay for it. This attention to martial matters was soon to be justified. The quarrel between Edward II and the Earl of Lancaster, which in the last 2 years had almost brought civil war to England, had by August 1318 been patched up by the Earl of Pembroke. An uneasy kiss of peace had been exchanged between the two opponents on a bridge over the river Surrey, near Loughborough, but the more compelling impulsion to harmony was the loss of Berwick to the Scots. The national prestige was at stake. By June 1319, the forces of king and earl had joined muster at Newcastle, and from there, with the 12,000 men, Edward II marched on Berwick, leaving his queen Isabella at York. Every English baron of note had been summoned to join in the assault, and as they came up were allotted their own section opposite the walls of the town, so that the whole landward side between the Tweed and the sea was surrounded by a multitude of men, horses, stores, siege engines, and tents to form a city greater than a Berwick itself. Outside this broad ribbon of besiegers was laid out a defensive system of trenches and earthen ramparts to block a relieving force, and in the estuary of the river an English fleet lay anchored. When all these precautions had been taken, a detailed plan of attack was prepared. Each baron was appointed a place where he should strike. His men were provided with scaling ladders and scaffolding. Companies of archers were allotted to give covering fire, and sappers with pickaxes to undermine the walls. Early on the morning of the 7th of September, the English trumpets sounded, and a general assault began from the landward side. Although the battlements were as yet little more than a spear's length in height, the defenders throughout the day held their own, hurling down the scaling ladders and directing their catapults with deadly effect on the massed enemy below. Walter Stewart, with a troop of reserves, rode from place to place to see where help was needed, dropping off men to fill the gaps where the enemy pressed hardest. Meanwhile, at noon, when the tide was full, the English ships came up the river. The leading ship had been so prepared that our boat, filled with armed men, had been drawn halfway up the mast with a bridge of planks to let fall from the boat to the battlement. But she failed to get close enough for the fall bridge to reach it, and was left stranded by the ebbing tide, at which the defenders made a sally, set fire to the ship, killed some, and captured others, among them an engineer famous for his skill. All day the struggle continued without the English achieving a breakthrough, and when evening came they sounded the retreat and retired to their quarters. For the next 5 days, within eyesight of each other, the two sides prepared themselves for the next assault. The English constructed a huge machine on wheels, roofed with strong planks to contain beneath its canopy sappers to undermine the walls, and armed men to burst through the breach when it had been made. Because of its shape, it was called a sow. At the same time, a number of ships were fitted out in the same manner as that which had been burnt, but with strengthened topcastles to be filled with archers. Under the deadly discharge of their arrows, men would drag the vessels across the narrow strip of shallow water, which separated the river from the walls, and allow the drawbridge to rest upon the parapet. The Scotsmen, under the direction of John Crabbe, wheeled the huge catapult he had built into position opposite the sow, and next to it a movable crane against which were stacked bundles of faggots, mixed with pitch and tar, bound like casks in bands of iron. At dawn on the 13th of September, the English once more assailed the town. Under a hail of arrows, the foot soldiers advanced with their scaling ladders, while others slowly pushed the sow towards the wall. The English engineer who had been captured was brought to the spot, and threatened that if he failed to shatter her to pieces, he would surely die. In fear for his life, he manned the catapult, and, aiming, pulled the trigger. The first stone went straight over the sow, and fell behind her. The second flew forth, with a whiz and a roar, but landed close in front. For the third time the engineer bent over his catapult and aimed. This time the huge stone went straight to the sky, and then, plunging down, crushed through the roof of the sow, shattering the main beam in its descent. As the men inside crawled from the debris, a shout went out from the Scotsmen that the sow has farrowed. John Crabbe let grappling irons down from his crane to hold the sow in place, and then let his bundled faggots and, swinging them over the wall, burned it to ashes. With the tide flowing, the English ships were once more making toward the town. The engineer and catapult were hurried to the seaward side, and he was warned again, on pain of death, to show his skill. This time at the first shot he landed a stone in the hoisted boat of the leading ship, and the men were thrown out, turning over and over in the air, some stunned and some dead. No other vessel then dared approach. But on the landward side, the attack still continued with the losses mounting, and the women and little children taking over from the fallen, gathering up arrows in armfuls and carrying them to the men on the walls. Walter Stewart, riding inside the battlements with 100 armed men, found so many places where the defenders were dead or badly wounded that by the time he had made the circuit and filled the gaps, he had but one man left. It was at this moment the news was brought to him that the English had stormed the outworks of the Merry Gate and set the gate on fire. Having no men spare from the fighting on the walls, he called out the garrison of the castle, the last defense if the town fell, and, flinging open the gate from within, drove the attackers back, and, after stamping out the fire, held the entrance until the enemy withdrew. So for the second time, night fell with Berwick unsubdued. Robert Bruce had taken the measure of his opponents. He would relieve the town, but he had neither the army nor the intention to try to break through the entrenchments the English had so painfully created to guard themselves against his attack. By concentrating on Berwick, they had left the whole of the hinterland unprotected. He conceived the daring project of seizing the Queen of England from her residence near York, and, with her as hostage, dictating the terms of peace. A flying column under Douglas and Randolph was sent post-haste to Borough Bridge to link with Scottish agents in the city of York. By ill luck, one of these was apprehended and under torture revealed the plot. When the Archbishop was advised of his story, he could scarcely believe that the two most famous warriors of Scotland would have come 100 miles out of their country when the English were on the doorstep, but the spy swore that he would lay his head on the block if his report was proved untrue. The Archbishop of York and the Bishop of Ely gathered together a great concourse of citizens and yeomen, priests, clerks, monks, and friars to bring the Queen into the city, and from there dispatched her by water to Nottingham. On the next day, having been told that the Scots were few in number and hidden in a wood near Milton, some 12 miles north of York, where the Swale joins the Aussie, the Archbishop decided to attack them. And when his motley following set out at a leisurely pace in that direction, after pausing for their dinner, which the Archbishop had served on silver plate, they began to cross the bridge that spans the Swale. As men unskilled in war, says the Lanarkos Chronicle, they marched all scattered through the fields and in no kind of array. The Scots, when they saw them coming, set fire to a large amount of hay, which had been gathered there, and in the drifting smoke their enemies lost all coherence. As the smoke cleared, the English saw the Scots drawn up in a single schiltron, which advanced towards them with a shout so terrifying that they lost all faith in divine protection and took to their heels. Then the Scots, breaking up the schiltron in which they were massed, mounted their horses and pursued the fugitives, killing both clergy and laymen, driving many to drown in the Swale, and capturing others. If the battle had not been fought in the late afternoon and brought to a close by night, not an Englishman would have escaped. 300 priests were left dead upon the field, and for this reason the skirmish was thereafter called the Chapter of Milton. The Scots now spread throughout Yorkshire, burning and destroying, driving away the cattle, and leaving the blackened farmsteads to mark their progress through the land. No fewer than 84 towns and villages are noted in the English records as burned and pillaged in this raid. When news was brought to Edward II of the massacre at Milton and the widespread destruction caused by the Scots, he called his whole council together to decide whether it was better to continue the siege of Berwick until it was taken, or march back to England to protect their countrymen. There was bitter disagreement between the barons from the south and those from the north. The former wished to complete the capture of Berwick, the latter to break off and rescue their kinsmen. The king inclined to the former against the advice of the Earl of Lancaster, who then in dudgeon marched off with all his followers. Since these made up a third of the army, Edward II had no option but to raise the siege. He attempted to cut off Douglas and Randolph from their home base, but their intimate knowledge of the northern counties made it easy for them to elude him. From that time, rumors began to spread that the Earl of Lancaster was in league with Robert Bruce, and men pointed out that when the Scots swept across the border, only the lands of the Earl were left unravaged. Edward II had hardly disbanded his army when on the 1st of November, 1319, Douglas returned to England to carry out his most savage raid on the counties of Westmoreland and Cumberland. The harvest had just been gathered in, and for the first time, after 2 years of famine, the barns were filled, but all were put to flames and the livestock driven back to Scotland. Ever since Bannockburn, the Scottish king had offered peace in return for the recognition of his royal title and the independence of his kingdom, and evidence of his sincerity is recorded in the following letter of unknown date. To the most sincere prince, the Lord Edward, by God's grace, illustrious King of England, Robert by the same grace King of Scots, sends greetings in the names of him, by whom the thrones and rulers are governed. Since while kindly peace prevails, the minds of the faithful are at rest, the Christian way of life is furthered, and all the affairs of Holy Mother Church and of all kingdoms are everywhere carried on more prosperously. We, in our humility, have judged it right to entreat of your Highness most earnestly that, having before your eyes the righteousness you owe to God and to the people, you desist from persecuting us and disturbing the people of our realm, so that there may be an end of slaughter and shedding of Christian blood. Everything that we ourselves and our people, by their bodily service and contributions of wealth, can do, we are now and shall be prepared to do sincerely and honorably for the sake of good peace, and to earn perpetual grace for our souls. If it should be agreeable to your will to hold negotiations with us upon these matters, let your royal will be communicated to us in a letter by the hands of the bearer of this present letter. But Edward II, remote from his northern subjects and little aware of their increasing sacrifices as a result of his obduracy, had rejected all overtures. Now, after his failure at Berwick, the anger of his northern barons, the lamentations of his decimated clergy, and the evidence from his own eyes of the devastated valleys of Yorkshire, persuaded him to open negotiations for a truce. Envoys from both countries met at Berwick on the 22nd of December 1319, and agreed terms. The truce was to last for 2 years from the 1st of January 1320. Edward II undertook to destroy Harbottle Castle on the River Coquette, and Bruce not to build any castles on the Scottish side of the border, a face-saving clause, for Edward, as the policy of the Scottish king, had always been to demolish any castle he captured. Ironically, Bruce would in any event have ceased his raids. A severe outbreak of scab had occurred among the sheep in northern England, and he had issued stringent regulations against the movement of livestock. What Edward conceded with one hand, he tried to recoup with the other. Within a month of the truce being signed, his representatives at the Holy See had persuaded the Pope to renew his fulminations against the Scots. In a bull of unprecedented rancor, the Supreme Pontiff summoned the Scottish king and prelates to appear at Avignon to answer for their misdeeds. On this occasion, his terms of address was to Robert Bruce, governing the Kingdom of Scotland, a slight improvement on the Robert Bruce acting as King of Scots, which he had previously used, but not enough for the king to accept the document. In retaliation for its rejection, the Pope commanded the Archbishop of York and the bishops of London and Carlisle to repeat the notices of excommunication against Bruce and his companions on every Sabbath and feast day throughout the year, and a little later included the Bishop of St. Andrews, Dunkeld, Moray, and Aberdeen in the same interdict. The papal invective at last provoked a noble remonstrance from the Scottish nation. Known as the Declaration of Arbroath, it is believed to have been written by Bernard Linton, Chancellor of Scotland and Abbot of Arbroath. It was sealed with the seals of 8 earls and 31 barons, and in the name of the community of the realm it was handed to Sir Adam Gordon and Sir Edward Maupassant on the 6th of April 1320 for safe delivery to the Pope of Avignon. It began by relating briefly the history of Scotland from earliest times, how their people had been converted to Christianity by St. Andrew, and had received from the predecessors of the Pope security and privileges as the especial charge of the brother of St. Peter. Beneath this protection, they had dwelt in freedom and quietness until the King of England, Edward I, pretending to be their friend, had invaded their country when it was without a king and inexperienced in war. The letter then related the cruelties and hardships endured by clergy and laymen under English rule, and continued in phrases of mounting eloquence. At length it pleased God, who alone can heal after wounds, to restore us to liberty from those innumerable calamities by our most serene Prince, King and Lord, Robert, who, for the delivering of his people and his own rightful inheritance from the enemy's hand, did like another Joshua or Judas Maccabeus, most cheerfully undergo all manner of toil, fatigue, hardship, and hazard, the divine providence, the right of succession by the laws and customs of the kingdom, which we will defend till death, and the due and lawful consent and assent of all the people made him our king and prince. To him we are obliged and resolved to adhere in all things, both upon his right and his own merit, as being the person who restored the people's safety in defense of their liberties. But, after all, if this prince shall leave these principles he has so nobly pursued, and consent that we of our kingdom be subjected to the king or people of England, we will immediately endeavor to expel him as our enemy, and as the subverter both of his own and our rights, and will make another king who will defend our liberties, for so long as there shall be but 100 of us remain alive, we will never give consent to subject ourselves to the dominion of the English, for it is not glory, it is not riches, neither is it honor, but it is freedom alone that we fight and contend for, which no honest man will lose but with his life. Quietly, then, the letter reminded the Pope that he was the vice-regent of one who makes no distinction between Jews nor Greeks, Scots nor English, and begged him to instruct the King of England to be content with what he possessed, and suffer us to live in the narrow spot of Scotland, beyond which is no habitation, since we desire nothing but our own. The letter ended with both a promise and admonition. God, from whom nothing is hid, knows with what cheerfulness both our king and we would go to the relief of the Holy Land if the King of England would leave us in peace, and we do hereby testify and declare it to the Vicar of Christ and to all Christendom. But if your holiness do not sincerely believe this, and remain too trustful of the English tales, and favor them to our destruction, then we must believe that the Most High will lay to your charge all the blood, loss of souls, and other calamities that will follow between us and them. We commit the defense of our cause to him, who is the sovereign king and judge. We cast the burden of your cares upon him, and hope for such an issue as may give strength and courage to us, and bring our enemies to nothing. The Most High God long preserve your serenity and holiness for his holy church. Few men could fail to be stirred by this declaration of Scottish independence, comparable to that of the United States 426 years later. The impact on the Pope was immediate. His fulmination ceased, touched in his most tender spot by the offer of support for his long-desired crusade. He sent a stern letter to Edward II, exhorting him to make peace with the Scots, so that the forces of both countries could be directed against the Paynims. A flurry of diplomatic activity ensued. The English king appointed commissioners headed by the Archbishop of York to treat with the Scots for a permanent peace. 2 papal nuncios were sent by the Holy See, and 2 envoys from the court of France, whose king offered to mediate between the 2 parties. Negotiations dragged on into the spring of 1321 at Newcastle, Berwick, and Bamberg, without any move by the English towards recognition of Scottish independence, and were then abandoned. The English, who had the advantage of representatives attending the Pope, persuaded him that the breakdown was entirely the fault of their ungodly opponents. In consequence, in February 1321, he fired a salvo of no fewer than 6 bulls against the Scots, directing that all invaders of England should be excommunicated, that the Scottish bishops should appear before the Pope, and that Robert Bruce should once more be doomed to hell. Yet the hand of God seemed not to have been removed from the King of Scots. for in the previous year his queen, 6 years after their reunion, had at last shown that she was capable of conceiving by giving birth to a daughter, and he himself had survived a plot against his life. A hint of its existence was given by the indiscreet chatter of the Countess of Strathern, and as suspicion began to grow, Murdoch of Menteith, a Scottish nobleman long resident in England and believed to have been one of the original conspirators, decided to journey to Scotland and reveal the whole matter to the king. Its object was to kill Robert Bruce and place Sir William Soulis, hereditary seneschal of Scotland, on the throne. Sir William's father, Sir John Soulis, had been one of the unsuccessful claimants to the throne in 1292. Tracing his descent from the illegitimate half-sister of Alexander III, Sir William's mother was the daughter of Alexander Comyn, one-time Earl of Buchan. Agnes Comyn, Countess of Strathern, was his aunt. The others said to be involved were 4 barons: Roger Mowbray, Patrick Graham, Eustace Maxwell, and David Brecon, 2 knights, Gilbert Malherbe, and John Logie, and 1 esquire, Richard Brown. The plot would appear to be the last dying paroxysm of the old Comyn-Bruce feud. Sir William of Soulis was seized at Berwick, where he had been gathering about him a group of young squires, and the others were swiftly rounded up. A parliament, later known as the Black Parliament, was summoned at Scone on the 4th of August, 1320, to try the conspirators. Sir William Soulis made confession of the whole plot, and he and the Countess of Strathern were imprisoned for life. Graham and Maxwell were acquitted. Malherbe, Logie, and Brown were found guilty and executed. Roger Mowbray had died before the Parliament met, but his corpse was brought before the judges on a litter. Under an ancient law, the sentence of treason involving a disinheritance of land, execution, and dismemberment could only be pronounced upon the body of a convicted person, alive or dead. On the intervention of Robert Bruce, his corpse was spared mutilation and allowed a decent burial. Sir David Brecon claimed in his defense that the conspirators had sworn him to silence, and then revealed the plot, that he had refused to join them, but could not break his word. This delicacy of conscience matched ill with the pattern of disloyalty in his career. After his defeat by Bruce at Inverary in 1309, he had sworn allegiance to him as King of Scots, yet by 1312 he had reverted to the English and was in receipt of a pension from Edward II. He fought against the Scots at Bannockburn and was taken prisoner. Once more, he vowed his service to Bruce and was once one of the signatories of the Declaration of Arbroath. Yet now, by his silence, he had placed his monarch's life in jeopardy. He was condemned to be drawn behind horses through the streets of Perth, and then hanged and beheaded. Sir Ingram de Umfraville, one-time guardian of Scotland and famous warrior, had been captured after Bannockburn, where he had fought at the side of the English king. He had made his peace with Bruce, received his Scottish estates, and affirmed his intention of settling there by affixing his seal to the Declaration of Arbroath. But David Brecon had been his friend, and in anger at his death, he renounced his fealty to Bruce. With characteristic generosity, Bruce allowed him to go free, attend his friend's funeral, and have time to sell up his Scottish estates before departing for England, where Edward II, under the polite fiction that he had never changed his allegiance, restored to him his English lands. The circumstances of the conspiracy have remained obscure, but that Robert Bruce, who was a humane man, allowed the severest penalty to be exercised on a knight whose service against the Saracens had earned him the title of the Flower of Chivalry, argues that it was a much more dangerous threat that can be deduced from the brief records that exist. Murdoch of Menteith was rewarded for his information by a grant of lands forfeited by the conspirators, and in 1323 was granted the earldom of Menteith, which had become vacant when his niece, Mary of Menteith, for whom it had been held in trust, resigned her interest. Chapter 16. The truce signed in December 1319 held throughout 1321, and the northern counties had a short reprieve from the ravages of the Scots, but elsewhere in England events moved towards civil war. Hugh Despenser the Younger, who after the death of Piers Gaveston had become the chief object of Edward II's affections, roused the anger of the Marcher lords by his territorial aggrandizement in Wales. Taking to arms, they joined forces with the Earl of Lancaster, and, marching on London, intimidated the king into sending the favourites and his father into exile. Their triumph was short-lived. 5 months later their opposition had lost cohesion. Edward II, seizing his opportunity, raised an army, recalled the Despensers, and advanced against the Marcher lords. Some surrendered without a fight. Others, under the Earl of Hereford, fled north to join the Earl of Lancaster at Pontefract. The final clash between king and earl was now to take place. The earl had already entered into negotiations with the Scots for their support in dethroning his cousin, offering in return a permanent peace and full recognition of Scottish independence. It is unlikely that Bruce took these overtures seriously, but anything which weakened England was to his advantage, and he gave Randolph and Douglas leave to arrange a meeting with Lancaster and Hereford to discuss details. This in no way altered his military plans. No sooner had the 2-year truce ended on the 1st of January 1322 than he sent Randolph, Douglas, and Walter Stewart on a powerful raid over the border. Randolph to Darlington, Douglas to Hartlepool, and Walter Stewart to Richmond, plundering or taking ransom. In vain the northern knights appealed for help to Lancaster, who was stationed with his army at Pontefract, but he feigned excuse, says the Lanarkos Chronicle, and no wonder, seeing that he cared not to take up arms in the cause of a king ready to attack him. The English king, indeed, was on his way. Gathering his forces at Coventry, he bypassed Burton-on-Trent, where Lancaster and Hereford had posted their army to block his passage of the river, and made for their headquarters at Pontefract. The earls hastily retreated northwards, hoping to link up with the Scots, but Andrew Harclay, the governor of Carlisle, by a brilliant move raised the levies of Cumberland and Westmoreland, and, avoiding the Scots in Teesdale, took up a position at Boroughbridge, covering both the ford and the bridge by which the rebels would have to cross the river Ure. Mindful of the lessons of Courtrai and Bannockburn, he posted his pikemen in Siltron formation opposite the bridge, and fords supported by archers on both flanks. On the 16th of March Lancaster advanced to the attack, sending Hereford and the infantry to seize the bridge, while he himself with the cavalry attempted to cross by the ford. Hereford was killed on the bridge, as he led his men, and Lancaster repulsed by the hail of arrows that decimated his horses. The next morning, with most of Hereford's men deserting, he surrendered to Andrew Harclay. He was taken before Edward II at Pontefract, who, without holding parliament or consulting his peers, had his head cut off as 10 years before the earl had done to Piers Gaveston. Edward II was now like the bullfrog in the fable, full-blown with success. He had achieved his long-deferred revenge, freed himself from the bonds of the Lords Ordainers, and, as he wrote exuberantly to the Pope, requesting him to worry no more about the truce with the Scots, determined to establish peace by force of arms. In furtherance of this resolution, he issued orders for the muster of an army which was to excel in number that which he had led to Bannockburn. Besides the heavily armed cavalry supplied by his supporting barons under feudal service, crossbow men and mounted spearmen were summoned from as far away as Aquitaine. Every village in England was ordered to furnish 1 foot soldiers fully armed. Taxes were levied on the clergy, cities and towns for the hiring of archers and infantry. Sir Robert Leybourne was placed in command of a naval squadron to attack the west coast of Scotland, and Sir Robert Bataille of a fleet to escort the transport ships along the east coast into the Firth of Forth, loaded with provisions for the army. When all was ready, Edward II in the early days of August set off for Newcastle towards the border at the head of an enormous force. Robert Bruce had observed these preparations with almost contemptuous indifference. His strategy for dealing with invasion had long been decided, so much so that on the 1st of July, while the English were still lumbering towards their assembly area in the east, he entered England on the west. Passing through Cumberland, blundering as he went, he rode across the Dodon sands to Furness Abbey, where the abbot paid ransom for immunity. Still making use of the sands at low tide, he moved swiftly along the coast to Lanarkshire, which he sent up in flames. There he was joined by Douglas and Randolph, and together they drove south as far as Preston, which suffered the same fate as Lancaster, and by the 12th of July they were back on the outskirts of Carlisle after a penetration of 80 miles into England. They encamped near Carlisle for 5 days, trampling and destroying as much of the crops in the neighbourhood as they could with the herds of cattle they had rounded up, and re-entered Scotland on the 24th of July. Bruce had assembled his army at Culross, on the north side of the Firth of Forth. He had given orders that all the south-east between the border and the Forth should be left bare of man, beast, crop, and habitation. The inhabitants of that district had become used to such evacuations. They built their dwellings by affixing poles in the ground, filling the gaps between with turf and stones and covering the roof with brushwood and turf. To these, they set fire on the approach of the English, and drove their livestock into the forest and broken uplands, returning after the invasion was over to re-erect their simple homes. Edward II marched through the scorched landscape of the Lothians unopposed. At Edinburgh, he waited 3 days for the arrival of his provision ships, but these had been delayed by contrary winds, and the stores he had brought with him had begun to be exhausted. Foragers were sent into the countryside, but returned to the king empty-handed, except for one lame cow which had been found grazing in a field near Traynott. At which the Earl of Surrey exclaimed, "This is the dearest beef that ever I saw." By late September, hunger had forced Edward II to withdraw his famished army into his own country, where the crops had now been gathered in. His starving soldiers fell upon these with such avidity that an outbreak of dysentery attacked their weakened frames, and their dying bodies littered the roads by which the English retired to Yorkshire. Such was the invasion which Edward II had boasted to the Pope, which accomplished the final conquest of Scotland. The only positive actions achieved by this mighty force were the sacking of the abbeys of Holyrood and Melrose, and the burning of that of Dryburgh, results that can have brought little consolation to the supreme head of the Church. Meanwhile, north of the Firth of Forth, Robert Bruce had collected an immense host from all parts of his country, all the power of Scotland, of the Isles, and the rest of the Highlands. On the 1st of October, 1322, as the English king retreated across the border in the east, the Scottish king led his army across the fords of the Solway in the west. Taking the familiar route along the Eden Valley and Wensleydale, with a horde of refugees fleeing before his pillagers, he reached North Alclorton on the 12th of October. Here his scouts informed him that Edward II and his queen were lodged in Rivolk's Abbey, 15 miles to the southeast. In an attempt to surprise them, Bruce made a forced march through the night of the 13th of October, but as dawn broke on the 14th, he found his direct route blocked by an English force under the Earl of Richmond posted to the western edge of Scouten Moor on the heights of Sutton Bank. The single axis up the steep hillside was a rocky pass spanned at the summit by the enemy advanced guard under Sir Thomas Uthred and Sir Ralph Cobham. To make a frontal assault appeared suicidal, but the only detour was a 14-mile circuit by Helmsley, and the chance of capturing Edward II would be lost. After consulting his commanders, Bruce decided on an immediate attack, believing that many of the English, after their recent experiences, were demoralized. The desperate task of scaling the pass was given to Douglas, supported by a major part of the army. As he was ordering the ranks, Randolph came running to join him, with 3 of his esquires, and the 2 comrades in arms advanced side by side towards the enemy. Sir Thomas Uthred and Sir Ralph Cobham, reputed to be the 2 of the bravest knights of England, held the narrow gorge, and their followers above and behind discharged a hail of arrows and boulders on the ascending Scots. Progress was painfully slow, so Bruce released his reserve of agile Highlanders to scramble up a precipitous cliff on his flank, hidden by a shoulder of the hill. The last few to reach the top had hardly time to get their breath before they saw the Earl of Richmond coming over a fold of the plateau with reinforcements for his advance guard. With a wild cry, the Highlanders charged, and the English knights, taken by surprise, fled like hares before greyhounds, as Sir Thomas Grey scornfully reports, leaving Richmond and Henry du Sully, Grand Butler of France, in the hands of the Scots. The advance guard was now assailed from front and rear, and all resistance crumbled. Uhtred and Cobham yielded up their swords. The pass was cleared, and Douglas and Randolph, joining forces with the Highlanders on the summit, moved against the main army, which retreated in disorder. Walter Stewart, with 500 troopers, pressed swiftly on to capture the English king, but Edward II, warned just in time, leapt on his horse, leaving behind for the second time in 8 years the Great Seal of England and his royal baggage and treasure. Walter Stewart and his men pursued him from Rivaux to Bridlington, and from Bridlington to York. But the king outpaced them, and when they reached the gates of the city, they found them bolted and barred. They returned to Rivaux, where Bruce had made his temporary headquarters to deal with the immense booty abandoned by the English and to sort out the prisoners. The Earl of Richmond was the first of these to be brought before the Scottish king, and was received with extreme coldness, whether because he had spoken slightingly of Bruce, or insulted Bruce's queen when she was captive in England, or for some other reason. Bruce referred to him, in the presence of all, as a caitiff, had him imprisoned closely for 2 years, and only released him in return for the prodigious ransom of £20,000. In marked contrast, he received Henry du Sully and the other French lords with great courtesy. Conscious of the advantage of winning the goodwill of the King of France, he assured them that he was well aware that they took part in the battle, not from personal enmity to him, but, as honorable knights should, in support of their host. He offered them his hospitality for as long as they should wish to remain, and in due recourse return them to their country free of ransom. This politic gesture brought its reward. Henry de Sully, the leading French prisoner, acted as a skillful go-between in the negotiations which led to the Anglo-Scottish Truce of 1323. During the course of these negotiations, Bruce had occasion to write a letter to de Sully, which reveals both his own unruffled good humor and the perverse refusal of his royal opponent to face reality. Robert, by God's grace, King of Scotland, to the most noble Henry, Lord of Sully, knight, his good friend, affectionate and loving greeting. You will recall, my lord, how it was stated in our letter sent to the King of England, and how also we informed you by word of mouth, that we desired, and still do desire at all times, to negotiate with the King of England on a final peace between him and us, saving always to us and to our heirs our realm free and independent, and also the integrity of our allies. If the English king had been agreeable, we were willing to make a truce until Trinity, the 22nd of May. Regarding this, my lord, we have received your letters and transcripts of letters from the King of England, declaring that he has granted a truce to the people of Scotland, who are at war with him. To us, this is a very strange way of speaking. In earlier truces, even though the English king has not designed to call us king, we have at least been named as principal on one side, as he has on the other. But it does not seem to us advisable to accept a truce in which no more mention is made of us than the humblest man in our kingdom, so that we could demand no more than any other if the truce were to be infringed wholly or in part. But if Edward II would not appreciate the weakness of his situation, others could. The Scots had returned to their country by the 2nd of November 1322, adding to the spoils of their victory at Old Byland near Rivaux by extracting ransom from the town of Beverley, still further south. Soon after their departure, Andrew Harclay, governor of Carlisle, reached Edward II at York. He found him, all in confusion, and no army mustered. Harclay was a man of strong character, a stern administrator, and a brave and able soldier. For 8 years he had maintained his city inviolate, while the countryside around went up in flames before the invading Scots. During the Barons' revolt he had, by sheer personality, drummed up within a few weeks a scratch force from the disheartened populace of Cumberland and Westmoreland, and inspired it with the resolution to defeat the mighty Earl of Lancaster and save the King of England. For this he had been created Earl of Carlisle and Warden of the Western Marches. Now, when the Earl of Carlisle perceived that the King of England neither knew how to rule his realm, nor was able to defend it against the Scots, who year by year laid it more and more waste, he feared lest at last the king should lose the entire kingdom. So he chose the lesser of two evils, and considered how much better it would be for the community of each realm if each king should possess his own kingdom freely and peacefully without homage, instead of so many homicides and arsons, captivities, blunderings, and raidings taking place each year. Returning to Carlisle, Harclay disbanded his levies, and on the 3rd of January 1323, went secretly to Robert Bruce at Lochmaben. There, after protracted discussion with Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, a treaty was signed between the King of Scots and the Earl of Carlisle, pointing out that both kingdoms had prospered so long as each had a king from its own nation, and was maintained with its own laws and customs. The signatories agreed that Robert Bruce and his heirs should be upheld as sovereign rulers of an independent Scotland, and that they in turn should do all that they could for the realm of England. For this purpose, there were to be 12 commissioners, 6 to be chosen by the community of Scotland, and 6 by the Earl of Carlisle, and these would work out the details for the common profit of both countries. If within a year the King of England consented that the King of Scotland shall have his realm free and quit for himself and his heirs, then the King of Scotland would found an abbey for the souls of those slain in the war, and endow it with 500 marks a year, and would pay to the King of England 40,000 marks at the rate of 4,000 a year, and would grant to that king the right to choose a wife from his own family for the male heir of Scotland, provided the 12 commissioners considered that this would redound to the common advantage of both countries. Andrew Harclay made no secret of this treaty. On returning to Carlisle, he summoned the chief men of his earldom, who endorsed his action, while the poor folk, middle class, and farmers in the northern parts were very content that the King of Scotland should freely possess his kingdom on such terms that they themselves might live in peace. But however statesmanlike the solution presented by Harclay, and however welcome in the north, he was impinging on the prerogative of the crown, and aroused the fury of his king, too weak to attack him in his earldom. Edward II had him taken by stealth through the treachery of a friend, and, after a summary trial on the 3rd of March 1323, degraded him from his earldom and knighthood, and condemned him to be drawn, hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. The Earl of Carlisle, with most steadfast countenance and bold spirit, as it seemed to the bystanders, went to suffer all those pains. Then under the gallows, whole in body, strong and fiery in spirit, and powerful in speech, he explained to all men the purpose he had in making the treaty with the Scots, and so yielded himself to undergo his punishment. So died the most resolute and capable of Edward II's lieutenants, who, by his own efforts, had raised himself from obscurity to the highest rank of chivalry. It is impossible to believe that he had not intended to present the treaty to Edward II, with a plea for its endorsement, but he was never given the chance. 4 times before his death, he made confession to different priests, the last to the warden of the Minaret friars, and all justified him and acquitted him of intention and taint of treason. He was not the first nor the last to learn by experience how frail can prove the friendship of princes. Andrew Harclay's bold initiative and grisly death were not in vain. A little over 2 months later, the English government, conscious of the popular support his proposals had received, and the risk of a leaderless Carlisle falling to the Scots, concluded at Bishopthorpe, near York, on the 30th of May 1323, a truce for 13 years. This was ratified by Bruce at Berwick 8 days later, under the style and appellation of King, a ratification which Edward II accepted, and in so doing tacitly acknowledged the royal title he affected to deny. Apart from clauses to improve peaceful relations between the two countries, the main concessions by the English were an undertaking not to oppose a Scottish approach to the Pope for the removal of his interdict, and to concede a neutral status to ships trading between Scotland and other countries, whether at sea or driven to the shores of England by the stress of weather. The latter clause was particularly relevant in view of the change of affairs in Flanders. The Count of Flanders had long been a friend of Scotland, and as recently as 1319 had snubbed Edward II when he asked him to break off relations with that country. By the summer of 1322, this friendship had become so marked that the English feared Flemish naval attacks on their coast. But in September 1322, the Count of Flanders died. His heir was a child in the regents of Flanders, won round by English diplomacy or gold. On the 18th of April 1323, expelled all Scots from their land. A valuable source of supply and convoy protection was suddenly removed, and the merchant ships to and from Scotland exposed to greater harassment by the English fleet. As a result of the treaty, such anxieties were abated. Freed from the opposition of the English crown, the opportunity had now been given for Scotland to seek return within the pale of Christendom. Although her church had nobly supported Bruce, in spite of papal wrath, there were yet tender consciences among all classes which would receive consolation from the relenting of the Holy See. It was decided to send Thomas Randolph on an unofficial mission to ascertain the temper of the Pope. In the closing months of 1323, he made his way to Avignon, accompanied by Henry de Sully, Grand Butler of France. Henry de Sully, during his residence with Robert Bruce after the Battle of Old Byland, evidently conceived a great liking for his host. He acted as his intermediary for the Bishopthorpe truce, and it would appear that it was by his good offices that Randolph was received in audience by the Pope, for Sully was present throughout. The details of this interview on the New Year's Day, 1324, are given in a letter sent by the Pope to Edward II later in January. They reveal with what skill the veteran soldier manipulated the Pope to his purpose. He began by humbly asking his permission to go and fight in the Holy Land in fulfillment of a private vow. The Pope replied that he was unable to grant this to one whom he had excommunicated, and in any event, the impact of a single warrior would have little effect on the heathen. How different it would be if Randolph could bring about a permanent peace between Scotland and England, and so release their armies for this great enterprise. Randolph, in answer, said that Scottish ambassadors had already been appointed to appear before His Holiness, to plead for reconciliation, so that this might be brought about, and he asked that safe conducts might be issued for their journey to Avignon. The Pope regretted that it would be unseemly for him to grant credentials to excommunicated persons, but, having so salved his conscience, promised to make their travel possible by requesting the rulers through whose territories they would pass to give them protection. Randolph then explained that it was the dearest wish of his uncle, this King of Scots, to join with the King of France in a crusade to the Holy Land, and, even if the French king was prevented, to send a Scottish expedition headed by himself or his nephew. The Pope answered that he could not give his blessing to such an expedition while Randolph's uncle was still unreconciled to Holy Church. To this Randolph replied that no man was more aware of his obligations to Holy Church than his uncle, no more anxious to prove his obedience if he would be shown how. Unfortunately, owing to clerical errors, he had been prevented from knowing the wishes of the Holy Father. But, said Randolph, offering as it were a helpful suggestion from a private individual, these difficulties could be overcome by the simple method of addressing a letter to him by the title of king. Put in these terms, it seemed clear to the Pope that if he could improve the prospects of a crusade by a mere technical alteration, it was his duty to consent. However, a subsequent uneasiness caused him to write to Edward II in apologetic tones. "I remember to have told you," he wrote, "that my bestowing the title of king on Robert Bruce would neither strengthen his claim nor impair yours. My earnest desires are for reconciliation and peace, and you will know that my bull issued for attaining these salutary purposes will never be received in Scotland, and if I address it under any appellation but that of king, I, therefore, exhort you in your royal wisdom that you would be pleased patiently to suffer me to give him that title." Edward II replied angrily that to give his opponent the title of king could not be regarded as a matter of indifference, in that the Scottish nation would naturally conclude that the Pope intended to acknowledge the right where he had given the title. And, in spite of his promise in this Bishopthorpe truce not to inhibit a rapprochement between the Scots and the Holy See, he sent a powerful mission to the papal curia, with the chief purpose of widening the breach between the two parties. Claiming that the Scots had incurred the suspicion of heresy, he demanded, through his representatives, that the Pope should refuse to sanction the election of Scotsmen to episcopal office in their own country, because the Scottish prelates are they who cherish the nation in its rebellion and contumacy. The Pope reasonably replied that this would deprive the flock altogether of their religious shepherds, as no Englishman could receive admittance to Scotland. But through refusing this demand, he remained sufficiently intimidated by English pressure to take no further steps to lift his interdict. On the specious excuse that Berwick had been seized by the Scots in contempt of a papal truce, he claimed that absolution could not be granted unless they handed back the town. The Scots preferred to remain excommunicate. Nevertheless, the papal recognition of Bruce's right to be addressed as King of Scots was a diplomatic triumph which the English could not gainsay. It came at an opportune moment, for 2 months later, on the 5th of March, 1324, Queen Elizabeth gave birth to a boy who was christened David in honor of his great forebear David I, who had summoned the Bruces to Scotland. Edward II, as a calculated slight, celebrated the event by inviting Edward Baliol, the son of Tum Tabard, from his paternal estates in Normandy to the English court, there to disparage by his presence the legitimacy of the Bruce kingship. But throughout Scotland there was widespread rejoicing that the good King Robert, as he had now become known, had at last a son and heir. The Chancellor, Bernard Linton, composed a graceful tribute in Latin verse. Few can have rejoiced more thankfully than the Queen herself. She had not had an easy life. Married in 1302 while still in her teens, she had spent the next 4 years on and off at the court of Edward I, with a husband daily at risk for his secret plans of revolt, and a monarch whose savage temper was as unpredictable as a bull's. Then the escape to Scotland, and the hard and hazardous days as a new crowned queen, the flight to the heather after Methven, the struggle through the ice and snow in the bitter winter of 1306 to St. Duthoch's shrine, the capture, the 8 weary years of house arrest, often not knowing whether her husband was alive or dead, the forced moves from the Yorkshire manor at Burstwick in 1308 to Bestelsham in Oxfordshire, from that to Windsor in 1312, from there to Shaftesbury, and then again to Barking Abbey in 1313, and finally to Rochester prison in 1314. Allowed only the attendance of a few elderly ladies and often short of food and furniture. After that came the reunion with her husband who, after so many years of separation, must have seemed a stranger, and then the frustrating 6 years when all looked to her for an heir and she remained barren. and even her stepdaughter was snatched away by death. But now she was the mother of a prince, and one born at a time when at last a rest from strife seemed possible. It is true that negotiations held at York in November 1324 to translate the truce into a final peace ended in the usual stalemate, but there was no resumption of hostilities. She was at last granted the comfort and relaxation of a domestic life, for the king, her husband, after years of nomadic existence, in 1325, put in hand the building of a manor house for his family. He chose for the site the village of Cardross, on the north side of the Firth of Clyde, close to Dumbarton. It was in no way a fortified castle, but a substantial dwelling with hall, king's chamber, queen's chamber, chapel, kitchen, and larder. The roofs were thatched, and it had the luxury of glazed windows. There was a garden, a hunting park, an aviary for the royal falcons, and a slipway for the king's yacht. The land was bought from the Earl of Lennox, and its situation is significant both of the king's love of the sea and of the importance he attached throughout his reign to the security of the western approaches. By this time he had so arranged matters that the whole seaboard of the Western Highlands was in friendly hands, from his son-in-law, Hugh Earl of Ross, in the north at Wester Ross, down through the lands of Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, on the Sound of Sleat, those of his sister-in-law by marriage, Christiana of the Isles, and her half-brother Roari Macrocry at Garmoron, and of Sir Neil Campbell, his brother-in-law, and Angus MacDonald in southern Argyll, to both of whom he had made grants from the fortified lands of John of Lorne and the MacDougals. From all these, as part of their feudal service, he could call for the supply of a varying number of 26-oared galleys to keep open communications to Northern Ireland and maintain control of the Hebridean seas. For himself, he had built a great ship and other vessels. The Clyde became the natural center of his western navy. From his new home it would be under his personal supervision, and for his protection, contrary to his usual policy of dismantling fortresses, he left intact the royal castle of Dumbarton near his manor, repaired and victualled the castle of Skipness in Kintry, and, most remarkably, in 1325, built a new royal castle at Tarbert. Across the mile-wide isthmus, between its east and west locks, he cut a track for the haulage of galleys, giving a quicker passage between the open sea and the sheltered waters of the Clyde estuary. To encourage commerce with Ireland, which had proved in the past an entrepot between the continent and Scotland, when the trade routes across the North Sea had suffered blockade or harassment from the English navy, he created two new royal burghs, one at Ayr and the other alongside the castle at Tarbert, and as a final gesture towards his strategy in the west in 1328, when he knew his life was nearing its end, he called on Bernard Linton, his wise and brilliant chancellor, to leave his abbey at Arbroath, to become the Bishop of the Isles, and watch over the area which his king had built up and nurtured with such care. The peaceful years from 1323 to 1327 gave Bruce the opportunity to deal with political and economic matters in other directions. On the political side, his approach was conservative, conforming, as far as possible, to the pattern which had been established by his predecessor, Alexander III. The problem of rewarding those who had supported him from the earliest years, without disturbing existing landowners and creating centers of disaffection, was happily resolved by having at his disposal lands forfeited by a small group of irreconcilables, the Earl of Athol, John Belial, John Comyn of Badenoch, John Comyn Earl of Buchan, John MacDougall, and Dugald MacDowell. From these estates and the Royal de Mesnil, he was able to make munificent grants to his two outstanding lieutenants, Thomas Randolph and James Douglas, and other grants, in varying degrees, to his companions in the dark days of 1306 and 1307. Sir Gilbert de la Haye, the Constable, Sir Robert Boyd, Sir Robert Keith, the Mareschal, and Angus MacDonald of the Isles. Apart from these, his largesse went to his close relatives, his son-in-law, Walter Stewart, his brother-in-law, Sir Neil Campbell, married to Mary Bruce, and Sir Alexander Fraser, who married her after Sir Neil's death, and to his sister, Matilda's husband, Hugh, Earl of Ross. In short, the transfers remained within the baronial class, and, contrary to the usual outcome of civil war and chaos, no new men of humble origin emerged to join the ranks of nobility. The fabric of society retained its traditional texture and gave stability to his realm. On the economic side, his difficulties were less easy to overcome. In Scotland, it was held that the king must live of his own. His kingdom was, as it were, a vast private estate from which he had to obtain the means to pay for its administration, protection, and upkeep. It followed that in times of war his revenues were doubly hit by the need to purchase mounts and munitions and the falling off in the proceeds of trade and agriculture as men were drawn into the forces. Bruce partly resolved the problem by his recurrent raids into England. These were as much for the subsistence of Scotland as to compel the enemy to sue for peace. It is significant that the export of wool from Scotland in 1327 was the highest from that country throughout the 14th century. This was due partly to farmers along the borders and in the Lothians turning from arable to pastoral agriculture, as standing crops were too vulnerable to hostile raids, but also because for 10 years the Scots had turned the northern counties of England into a huge backyard from which to augment their stock of sheep, oxen, and horses. The consequent increase in the export of wool and hides brought much needed income to the king from the duties that had to be paid before the goods were shipped. Goods could only be shipped legally on the production of an export license to which had been affixed a special seal, a cocket, by the customs officer. Throughout his reign, Bruce encouraged the merchants of Scotland by the creation and revival of royal, baronial, and ecclesiastical burghs, with their complex of guilds, but it was only to the royal burghs, among which the most important were Berwick, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Dundee, and Perth, that he granted the use of the cocket, with resultant prosperity to their inhabitants. On the prosperity he was soon to draw. It was natural that he should wish to recompense the Scottish Church for all the support he had received in his struggle for independence, but his generosity so far exceeded the expectations of reward that it would seem that he retained throughout his life remorse for his sacrilege in the friary church at Dumfries, and sought expiation by his veneration of the saints and the endowment of the shrines. St. Filian, St. Thomas, St. Cuthbert, and St. Andrew were the special objects of his benevolence. He was the first king to acclaim St. Andrew as the patron saint of Scotland. On the 5th of July, 1318, accompanied by a concourse of magnates, clergy, and common folk, he attended the consecration of St. Andrew's Cathedral, begun in 1162, and completed during the bishopric of his old friend William Lamberton, and endowed the cathedral priory with an annual sum of 100 marks. An annual rent of 40 marks was granted to the Franciscan friars of Dumfries, and 20 to each of the other Franciscan houses in Scotland. Melrose Chapter was the recipient of an annual rent of £100 on the 26th of January 1326, and in March of that year of the very large sum of £2,000 for the reconstruction of its abbey. Payments were made for masses to be said daily for his brother Nigel Bruce and his brother-in-law, Sir Christopher Seton, nor did he forget to provide for a candle and lamp to burn perpetually on the altar of the blessed Saint Malachy in the Abbey of Coupat Angus. This beneficence played its part in creating a crisis in the royal finances. On the 15th of July, 1326, the king summoned a parliament at Cambus Kenneth Abbey and reported to the assembled prelates, earls, barons, and burghers that the lands and rents which of old used to partition to his crown had been so diminished by divers gifts and transfers occasioned by the war, that he did not have means of maintenance befitting his station. He asked that, in recognition of the hardships that he and his family had borne in the fight for the freedoms of them all, they should make provision for an increase in his income. Admitting that his request was reasonable, they passed a resolution granting him for his lifetime 1/10 of all rents and profits throughout the realm, while he in turn conceded that he would limit the requisition of goods and food to which he was entitled under an ancient royal prerogative. At the same Parliament, a new Act of Settlement was passed, by which the king's son David, now 2 years old, was designated successor to his father in precedence to Robert Stuart, and all present swore fealty to the infant child. Robert Stuart's father, Walter, had died 3 months earlier to the general grief and in particular to that of his father-in-law, the king, for he had trusted him with responsibility from an early age as a stripling at Bannockburn, as a governor of Berwick, as a cavalry leader of Old Byland, and had never found him wanting. His mourning coincided with that for the Queen's second son, John, who died in infancy. But as some compensation, the royal family were rejoiced by the marriage of Bruce's sister, Christina, widow of the Earl of Mar and of Christopher II successfully, to Andrew Moray, son of the patriot hero of Stirling Bridge, an inheritor of great estates, and soon to become a guardian of the realm. Chapter 17. Since the beginning of Edward II's reign, England had been at peace with France, but in November 1323, a local clash at St. Sandos, on the border of Gascony, occurred between the English and French. The ineptitude of Edward II's brother, the Earl of Kent, whom he sent as ambassador to Charles IV, the newly crowned King of France, to smooth over matters, caused a frontier incident to expand into a threat of war. Unwilling and ill-prepared for such an event, Edward II was persuaded to choose his queen, Isabella, as the most likely person to negotiate a settlement with her brother Charles IV. Landing in France in March 1325, she had managed by the middle of the summer to induce her brother to restore the provinces of Gascony and Ponthieu, which she had seized on condition that Edward II came to pay homage for them. Edward II was at that time entirely under the influence of his favorite, Hugh Despenser, whose administrative and financial reforms have excited the admiration of historians, but whose greed had antagonized a formidable section of prelates and barons within the kingdom, and whose intimacy with her husband had earned the bitter hatred of the queen. Conscious of his precarious position if Edward II left the country, Despenser accepted with alacrity the artful suggestion she made that the Prince of Wales should be sent to France to pay homage on behalf of his father. Once she had her son by her side, both she and her brother revealed their true intent. Charles IV refused to return Gascony and Ponthieu, and Isabella repaired to the court of the Count of Hanlot, who promised her men and money for an invasion of England in return for the offer of her son as husband for his daughter Philippa. It was while matters stood thus that Bruce, who had been following events, judged that the moment was ripe for an offer of alliance to the French. A deputation, headed by Thomas Randolph, was sent to the court of France with full powers of negotiation. They returned with the diplomatic triumph of a defensive alliance between Scotland and France. By the Treaty of Corbeil, signed in April 1326, both countries bound themselves to come to the aid of the other if either was attacked by England. Scotland was no longer isolated, but linked to the most powerful and opulent nation in Europe. Through the succeeding months, Queen Isabella's invasion of England was daily expected. Ships were hastily ordered by Edward II to Portsmouth, but mutiny broke out, and they never left harbor. On the 24th of September 1326, unopposed by an English fleet, Isabella and her lover, Sir Roger Mortimer, landed at the port of Harwich and, accompanied by the Earls of Norfolk and Leicester, advanced on London. Edward II and Hugh Despenser fled to the west as their followers melted away and took ship for Ireland, but contrary to winds drove them back to Cardiff. Captured in Glamorgan on the 16th of November, Hugh Despenser was executed, and Edward II imprisoned in Kenilworth Castle. Bullied throughout December and January, he finally succumbed to the threat that if he did not abdicate, the people of England would repudiate not only him, but his son also. On the 1st of February 1327, the Prince of Wales was crowned Edward III. Ronald, Earl of Mar, nephew of the Scottish king, who had been brought up with Edward II and remained his close companion, made post-haste to Scotland on the approach of Isabella's army to enlist his uncle's aid on behalf of his friend. Bruce, who had known him as a boy when he was his guardian, received him with great generosity, restored to him his earldom, and gave him encouragement in his plots to raise a Welsh force for the release of the captive king. As a result of these efforts, Edward II escaped from Berkeley Castle, to which he had been removed from Kenilworth, but was captured and once more immured. The discovery of another conspiracy to free him, and the near success of his previous liberation, determined his wife and her lover to end his life. Systematically he was ill-treated and starved in the hope that this would bring about his disease. But when his robust constitution failed to succumb to his treatment, a marrow bone was thrust up his rectum, and through it a red-hot poker to cauterize his entrails, so that his body could be displayed to the public gaze without sign of injury. The victim of natural death? On the 21st of September, 1327, Edward III was informed that his father was dead. Throughout 1326, Bruce had been vexed by the attacks of English ships on his trading vessels to the Low Countries and Hanseatic towns in contravention of the Bishorthorpe Truce. In some cases, Scottish merchants and their womenfolk had been murdered at sea and their cargo seized, and others, Scottish seamen putting into English harbors for shelter from pirates, had been arrested and clapped into prison. His complaints had been unheeded. The abdication of Edward II automatically released him from his truce, and he made the point sharply by attacking the castle of Northam on the day that Edward III was crowned. The attack was beaten off, but the English Council of Regency hastily passed an act prolonging the truce on their side of the border, and on the 6th of March, 1327, made a unilateral declaration that it was still in force. Commissioners were appointed to renew negotiations for peace, but as they failed to address their communications to the King of Scots, it must be assumed that they were playing for time, for even before the talks broke down, Isabella and Mortimer had begun the mobilization of an army. Bruce's response showed all his accustomed skill, taking advantage of the disorders in Ulster, stemming from the death of his father-in-law, the Red Earl. He landed in Antrim soon after Easter 1327, and by July of that year had forced Sir Henry Mandeville, the Ulster seneschal, to sign a humiliating truce to last 1 year from the 1st of August 1327. While he was engaged in rendering the English in Ireland ineffective, 3 flying columns under Douglas, Randolph, and Donald, Earl of Mar, crossed the English border throughout the Kydar Gap on the 15th of June and fanned south of Weardale, wasting the country as they went. Queen Isabella and Sir Roger Mortimer as regents, with Edward III, the young King of England, had assembled an army of vast proportions at York, including a crack contingent of 2,500 heavily armed Flemish cavalry, under John of Hainault, hired by the English treasury for the sum of £14,000, and a spectacular new weapon, the gunpowder cannon. After a splendid feast arranged by Queen Isabella for the Hainaulters and other foreign knights from as far away as Bohemia, which infuriated the xenophobe English and led to a riot, the huge army with its long column of baggage wagons left York on to the 10th of July and moved slowly to Durham. There, on the 18th of July, they had the first evidence of their enemy from the distant sight of smoke rising from farms and homesteads burnt by the Scottish raiders. For 2 days, they trundled across boggy moorland in pursuit, but never came in view of their quarry, for they were dealing with men skilled in mobile warfare, as has been vividly described by Lee Bell. These Scots are exceedingly hardy through their constant wearing of arms and experience in combat. When they enter England, they will in a single day and night cover 24 miles, for they ride on sturdy horses and bring no wagons with them. They carry no provisions of bread and wine, for their abstemious is such that they will live for a long time on stewed meat and drink river water. They need neither pots nor pans, for wherever they invade they find plenty of cattle, and use the hides of these in which to boil the flesh. Each man carries under the flap of his saddle an iron plate, and behind the saddle a little bag of oatmeal. When they have eaten the stewed meat, they place the plate on the fire, and when the plate is hot, They spread on it a little paste made of oatmeal and water, and make a thin cake in the manner of a biscuit, which they eat to comfort their stomachs. So it is no wonder that they can travel farther in a day than other soldiers. It became apparent to the English leaders that moving in heavy marching order with all their camp gear, they would never come up with their opponents. On the mistaken intelligence that the Scots were heading for the Tyne to cross the ford at Haydon Bridge, by which they had passed southwards, orders were given for the baggage train to be left behind, and for the rest of the army, unhampered by provision wagons, but with each man carrying a loaf of bread slung at his back, to make a forced march to the northern bank of the river to cut off the retreat of the enemy. Setting out at daybreak on the 20th of July, they reached their objective at dusk. All night they stood to arms, with the knights resting on the ground beside their horses, with the reins in their hands ready to mount at a moment's warning. But the Scots did not come, and the rain began to fall. It fell and fell without a break for 8 days and nights, while the English waited for the Scots. The river waters rose, and their encampment became a sea of mud. Their scant provisions were soon exhausted, and little could be obtained from the nearest towns of Carlisle and Newcastle, and even less from the ravaged countryside. There was no shelter. Few fires could be kindled from the green and sodden wood, and the very leather of the saddlery rotted from the continuous downpour. As their discomforts increased, the murmurs of mutiny grew louder, so that in desperation the word was given to recross the river and make for their base camp. But before they left, a proclamation was made throughout the army offering, in the king's name, a knighthood and a landed estate to any man who could locate the Scots. 16 squires set off in different directions. 4 days later, when the army had reached Blankland, one of these, named Thomas Rockby, came galloping into the camp. He had been taken prisoner by enemy scouts and brought before Douglas. When Douglas heard of his mission, he sent him back to gain his reward, and to tell the King of England that for more than a week they had been waiting to give him battle. The English army was thereupon drawn up in formation, and having heard mass, was guided by Rockby to where the Scots awaited them. About midday on the 31st of July, they came in sight of their enemy posted on a rocky ridge south of the river Wear, which, after the rains, was rushing in spate at the foot of their position. Attack was impossible. The English therefore sent heralds to ask the Scots either to come over to their side of the river, or allow them to cross unhindered to the Scottish side, so that they could have a stand-up fight. To which the Scots scornfully replied, "We are here in your kingdom, and have burnt and wasted your country. If you do not like it, then come and dislodge us, for we shall remain here as long as we please." Noting that their army lay between the Scots and their native country, the English leaders conceived the idea that, although half-starved themselves, they could blockade the Scots into surrender by remaining static in front and sending probing pincers on either flank. Some success attended both opponents. Douglas lured one of the flanking attacks into an ambush and destroyed some, and captured others. But in turn, the English circumvented Randolph's position and surprised and killed a large body of his men, who were resting in a wood behind. Aware from prisoners of the English plan, the Scots presented a facade of roistering festivity on their rocky eminence, with fires blazing and such blasting a noise with their horns, as Froissart relates, as if all the devils of hell had come there. Under cover of this commotion, they quietly removed themselves to a stronger position in a wood called Stanhope Park, 2 miles off, with a marsh protecting their rear, and the turbulent river still in front. It almost seemed as if Douglas was playing games with his enemy. The English army shifted its ground, and the blockade recommenced. But no sooner had they erected their bivouacs than Douglas, with 200 picked followers, fetched a wide circle over the river Wear during the night, and rode openly up to the far side of the English camp. A sentry challenged him, but, roundly dressing down the man for slackness, he was let pass, and swept with his 200 through the lines of tents, slashing their straining ropes left and right, until he reached the pavilion of the young King Edward. Only the suicidal gallantry of the royal household enabled the king to escape, and for troops to gather against the marauding Scots. But Douglas blew his horn for retreat to the river, and charged through the thickening mass of his enemy into the black night. By the arranged path to the river's edge, he waited to check his men as they passed. After a little, as no more came by, he was about to follow when an enemy straggler, roused from his sleep, came out of the darkness and hit him a violent blow with his club. Though tottering and stunned, he warded off his foe until his senses cleared, and then dispatched him. Meanwhile, his followers at the water's edge were about to turn back to look for him, when they heard his horn and rode to welcome him tumultuously. On his return to the main army, Randolph asked him how he had fared. "We have drawn blood," he replied laconically. Randolph sought always to emulate his companion in arms, and was eager to attack the English with a larger force, but Douglas dissuaded him by telling him the fable of the fisherman and the fox. Instead, they contrived once again to dupe the English. They remained quiet for several days, and then, by much movement and marshalling of troops in the late afternoon, they gave the impression that they were preparing for a night attack. The English stood to arms, but the Scots, leaving their campfires burning brightly, and scattered trumpeters sounding their horns, thinned away onto the apparently impassable marsh behind them. They had laid down a series of hurdles over the boggy patches, and as they moved forward, lifting them up as they went so that none could follow. When morning came and the English saw before them only a bare hillside, the Scots were many miles distant on their way to their native soil. The news was brought to the royal tent, and when Edward III, who was only 16, realized that after all the hardship and misery of his first campaign, the Scots had escaped without his ever having been able to show his prowess by a feat of arms, he burst into tears of vexation. His army was now in a pitiable condition, and towards the end had only been buoyed up by the hope of a decisive battle. The chivalry of Flanders, which had cost him so dear, reduced by the privation of a form of war which they had never yet experienced, leaned back on foot beside their English host to the city of York, bereft of their famous horses, which were either dead or unserviceable. Once arrived there, the whole army was disbanded. This was the signal for the completion of Bruce's strategy. He had neutralized Ireland, he had exhausted the English and allied troops by the cat-and-mouse tactics of his raiders. Now, on his return to Scotland to welcome his fellow countrymen back, he marshalled a fresh army, and early in September crossed into Northumberland at its head. One part of the force surrounded Norham Castle, and the ingenious John Crabbe began to erect his siege engines for its destruction. Another invested Alnwick, and passed the time until it should be starved into submission by conducting formal tournaments outside its walls. Such had become the consciousness of complete superiority among the Scots. The king himself made a leisurely progress through the countryside, hawking and hunting as he went, receiving tribute and letting it be known everywhere that he proposed to annex the northern counties and parcel them out among his followers. His bluff succeeded. Edward III and his regents were impotent. Their previous campaign had cost them £70,000, and when they summoned a parliament at Lincoln at the end of September to ask for funds to finance a further war, they met with a blank refusal. Faced with the possibility of losing part of the kingdom, they had no alternative but to sue for peace. Earlier in October, 2 English envoys, empowered to open talks for a lasting peace, waited on King Robert at Norham, where 35 years before Edward I had thrown off his mask and claimed the overlordship of Scotland. On the 18th of October, the Scottish king replied from Berwick with a letter dictating his terms. He was to have the kingdom of Scotland free, quiet, and entire for himself, and his heirs forever without any kind of homage. His son was to marry Edward III's sister. No one in Scotland or England should hold lands in the other country. A pact of mutual support was to be concluded in so far as it did not infringe the Franco-Scottish treaty. The Scottish king would pay £20,000 within 3 years of peace being signed. The English king would use his good offices to persuade the Pope to revoke his interdict. If the King of England was prepared to accept these 6 demands, Scottish envoys would meet his representatives at Newcastle on Tyne to hammer out the details of a final peace. Still, unable to accept the degree of England's humiliation, Edward III assumed the lofty language of a conqueror. He could only agree. He wrote from Nottingham on the 30th of October, to the 2nd and 5th of the terms received, and must reserve judgment on the rest. But when the Scots made clear that without a watertight agreement on the 1st there would be no negotiations, the weakness of his position compelled him to climb down. After appointing a commission on the 23rd of November, headed by the Archbishop of York, and issuing safe conducts to the Scottish envoys on the 25th of January, 1328, he summoned his Parliament to York in February. There, on the 1st of March, in the presence of the Scottish representatives, the following letters patent were endorsed by the King himself in council in Parliament, and placed in their hands. To all Christ's faithful people who shall see these letters, Edward, by the grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Aquitaine, greeting and peace everlasting in the Lord. Whereas we and some of our predecessors, kings of England, have endeavoured to establish rights of rule or dominion or superiority over the realm of Scotland, whence dire conflicts of wars waged have afflicted for a long time the kingdoms of England and Scotland, we, having regard to the slaughter, disasters, crimes, destruction of churches, and evils innumerable which, in the course of such wars, have repeatedly befallen the subjects of both realms, and to the wealth with which each realm, if united by the assurance of perpetual peace, might abound to their mutual advantage, thereby rendering them more secure against the hurtful efforts of those conspiring to rebel or to attack, whether from within or without, we will and grant by these presents, for us, our heirs and successors whatsoever, with the common advice, assent and consent of the prelates, princes, earls, barons, and the commons of our realm in our Parliament, that the kingdom of Scotland, within its own proper marches as they were held and maintained in the time of King Alexander of Scotland, last deceased, of good memory, shall belong to our dearest ally and friend, the magnificent Prince, Lord Robert, by God's grace, illustrious King of Scotland, and to his heirs and successors, separate in all things from the kingdom of England, whole, free, and undisturbed in perpetuity, without any kind of subjection, service, claim, or demand, and by these presents we denounce and demit to the King of Scotland, his heirs and successors, whatsoever right we or our predecessors have put forward in any way in bygone times to the aforesaid kingdom of Scotland. And for ourselves and our heirs and successors, we cancel wholly and utterly all obligations, conventions, and compacts undertaken in whatsoever manner with our predecessors, at whatsoever times, by whatsoever kings or inhabitants, clergy or laity, of the same kingdom of Scotland, concerning the subjection of the realm of Scotland and its inhabitants, and wheresoever any letters, charters, deeds, or instruments may be discovered bearing upon obligations, conventions, and compacts of this nature, we will that they be deemed cancelled, invalid, of no effect, and void, and of no value or moment. And for the full, peaceful, and faithful observance of the foregoing, all and singular, for all times we have given full power and special command by our other letters patent to our well-beloved and faithful Henry D. Percy, our kinsman, and William de la Zocchi of Ashby, and to either of them make oath upon our soul, in testimony whereof we have caused these letters patent to be executed. At long last, and in full measure, the King of Scots and his people had received what for 30 years of warfare they had striven to obtain. The language suggests the hand of Bernard Linton, it is possible that it was drafted in Scotland and then presented to the English Parliament for acceptance as the necessary preliminary to treaty discussions. These now moved swiftly to a conclusion. English commissioners, consisting of the bishops of Lincoln and Norwich, Sir Geoffrey Lee Scrope, the English Chief Justice, Henry Percy, and William de la Zucchi, travelled north to Edinburgh and reached the Scottish capital on the 10th of March, with full powers to conclude and proclaim a final peace. Within a week, the terms of the treaty had been agreed, and on the 17th of March they took place a ceremony which must rank as momentous in the annals of Scottish history. In a chamber within the precincts of Holyrood, where the Lord King of Scotland was lying stricken by a benumbing illness after his campaigning the previous summer, there gathered about him a great company of bishops, abbots, earls, barons, freeholders, and sufficient persons delegated by the burghs to receive the English representatives and witness the sealing of the documents. Close beside him were his two commanders, James Douglas and Thomas Randolph, whom long ago when they were young men he had chosen as his lieutenants, and whose feats of arms since then had made the name of Scotland renowned among the chivalry of Christendom. William Lamberton, the aged Bishop of St. Andrews, was there, to die later that year, and must have murmured a nunc dimittis as he watched the culmination of his 30 years of unending toil for the nationhood of his country. The chief officers of the household were present: faithful Gilbert de la Haye, the constable, Robert Keith, the mareschal, and many others, who had fought beside Bruce from his earliest days. Only the Queen was not there to share his triumph. She had died on the 26th of October 1327, but had lived just long enough to know the certainty of his success. And success it was. All 6 articles of the terms he had dictated in October 1327 were written into the treaty in entirety, with the exception of the 3rd, which related to landholding in the 2 countries. The 4th article on the part of mutual support was enlarged by a clause that the Scots would not help the Irish if they rebelled against the English, nor the English the Hebrideans and the Bannockburn if they rose against the Scots. In the 2nd article on the marriage between Joanna, Edward III's sister, and David, son of Bruce, the Scottish king undertook to settle £2,000 a year on his daughters-in-law. She was to be allowed to return to England if she became a widow and so wished, but if she was pregnant she would have first to obtain the permission of the Scots king and his barons. So much store did the English set by the royal marriage as a guarantee of the treaty, that they asked for an indemnity of £100,000 from the Scots if it did not take place by Michaelmas 1338. In actuality, both sides were anxious to hasten the event, and as soon as the English Parliament had met at Northampton and ratified the treaty signed at Edinburgh, and Edward III had affixed his seal on the 4th of May, arrangements were put in hand for the wedding. Early in July, Isabella, the Queen Dowager, and her daughter set out for Scotland, and on the 12th of July, Joan, aged 6, and David, aged 4, in the presence of a great gathering of prelates and noblemen from both countries, were married in the church at Berwick. The King of England could not bring himself to attend. The King of Scotland absented himself on the plea that he had not recovered from his illness. It would appear, however, that this was a diplomatic excuse to counter the discourtesy of the English king, for within a few weeks Bruce had sailed for Ulster. William de Burgh, grandson and heir of the Red Earl of Ulster, Bruce's father-in-law, was a guest at the wedding. His patrimony and the control of Carrickfergus were in dispute. The truce between Bruce and Sir Henry de Mandeville was about to end. Throughout his life, Bruce had taken an intense interest in maintaining a friendly presence in Northern Ireland. Now, on the understanding, presumably, that his great-nephew would ensure the continuance of amicable relations with Scotland, he escorted him with sufficient force to make certain the occupation of his Ulster heritage. It was Bruce's last military expedition. From now on he retired to his manor at Cardross, and diverted himself by sailing on the Clyde, or improving his garden and his orchards. His infirmity was increasing. Later medieval writers refer to it as leprosy. but this is highly unlikely, for throughout the Middle Ages, the segregation of lepers was so strict that even kings were cut off from their fellow men. It is pleasantly related by Barber that after Douglas and Randolph had escorted Queen Isabella and her cortege to the border on their way south from the wedding festivities, Bruce had sent for his 2 old companions to bring to his house the little bride and bridegroom, and had there entertained them all. For Bruce, with his humane nature, to risk infecting with the fatal disease 2 children, one of whom was his heir, is beyond belief. His symptoms much rather suggest recurrent, increasingly serious attacks of scurvy. He spent the Christmas of 1328 at Cardross, and in February 1329, feeling a little better, he set out on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Ninian near the southern coast of Wigtownshire. In October 1328, the Pope had at last removed his interdict from Scotland in excommunication from its king. But Bruce, as death approached, felt a stronger urge to make his peace with God, and sought the intercession of the saint. St. Ninian was the first missionary to bring Christianity to Scotland in the 5th century, and his name was linked in Bruce's memory with the first victorious clash at Bannockburn, hard by St. Ninian's Kirk. The king was carried slowly in a litter along the coastal road of Ayrshire, and had reached a little short of Castle Kennedy by Stanrire when he had a relapse. After resting there a month, he recovered sufficiently to continue south, reaching St. Ninian's shrine at Withorn on the 1st of April. Here he spent 4 or 5 days fasting and praying to the saint. From there, by slow stages, he travelled northwards through Galloway and Carrick. His route may have taken him by Glentrool, the scene of his first victory, and to Turnberry Castle, where he had set up a household for his little son, whom he had created Earl of Carrick. By the end of April, he was back at Cardross. He now felt his weakness increase daily, and sent letters to all the leading men in his kingdom to come to his bedside. When they were there assembled, he pledged them all to give their strength and loyalty to his son, and obey him when he came of age to be their king. Sirs, he then said to them, my day is far gone, and there remains but one thing, to meet death without fear, as every man must do. I thank God he has given me the space to repent in this life. For though me and my wars there has been a great spilling of blood, and many an innocent man has been slain, therefore I take this sickness and this pain as a penance for my sins. He went on to say that he had made a vow to God, that if he should live to see the end of his wars, and be able to leave the realm in peace and security, he would go in person to fight against the heathen. But when that time had come, his body had been stricken by mortal sickness, and since it could not go forward, he asked them to choose one among their number to carry his heart against the enemies of Christ. At this, they could not refrain from tears, but he chided them that it was better they set about what he had asked. So they retired, and came back saying that they had chosen Sir James Douglas, to which the king replied that, ever since he had thought of this enterprise, he had longed that Sir James would undertake it, and since they were all agreed, he was the more pleased if Sir James would consent. Then James Douglas knelt beside the king, and when he could speak for weeping, he thanked him for all the benefits he had received since he first came into his service, but above all, that he had been given the honor of taking into his keeping his master's heart, which all the world knew was so full of nobleness and valor. Then the king thanked him tenderly, and there was none in that company but wept for pity. A few days later, on the 7th of June, 1329, a little short of his 55th birthday, Robert Bruce, King of Scots, died. When he had been embalmed, his heart was taken out and given to Sir James Douglas, and his body carried in a funeral procession of great splendor to Dunfermline Abbey, and buried in the choir near to his Queen Elizabeth, and among the former kings and queens of Scotland. And when his people knew that King Robert was dead, the sound of sorrow went from place to place. Epilogue. Douglas had a casket made of silver and enamel, and in it he placed the heart of Robert Bruce, and carried it always on a chain about his neck. Early in the spring of 1330, he set sail from Berwick in a ship fitted out in a royal state, so that all might know that he was the bearer of the heart of Robert, King of Scotland, and on his way to lay it in the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He had on board 6 knights, linked in friendship, neighbouring landowners from the Stuart domains, Sir William Sinclair of Roslin, Sir Robert and Sir Walter Logan, Sir William Keith, Sir Alan Cathcart, and Sir Seymour's Lockhart of Lee, and one other knight unnamed. 26 squires and gentlemen were there to serve them. Their first port of call was Sluis in Flanders. Here Douglas remained 12 days, entertaining liberally on gold and silver plate, and letting it be known that any who wished to fight in the Holy Land were welcome to join his company. He then sailed in rough seas around the coast of Spain, and up the Guadalquivir River to drop anchor in the city of Seville. When Alfonso XI, King of Castile and Leon, heard that he had arrived, he came to greet him and offer him hospitality, and many foreign and especially English knights who had flocked to Spain to war against the Moors called at his lodgings to give him welcome, for his military prowess was acknowledged above all others throughout the camps of Europe. Douglas and his company rested for a while at Seville, after the hardships of their stormy voyage, but in March, the Moorish king of Granada advanced against the city, and the king of Castile and Leon marshaled his forces to meet him. He asked Douglas to lead the vanguard, and placed under his command all the foreign knights. On the 25th of March, at Zebas de Ardales, the armies came face to face. Douglas gave the order to charge, and both sides became locked in battle. But the Saracens employed a ruse with which Douglas was not acquainted. Suddenly they turned their horses and fled, pursued by the Christians. Douglas and 10 of his followers had drawn far ahead of the vanguard when the Saracens sharply checked and swung round to encircle them. Douglas turned too and might have escaped through the gap, but saw that Sir William Sinclair had been overtaken. With the 2 knights who were beside him, Sir Robert and Sir Walter Logan, Douglas turned yet again to rescue his comrade. In a moment they were surrounded by a multitude of Moors, and, fighting desperately, were all cut down. The rest of the vanguard were now approaching, and the Saracens once more wheeled round their horses, and galloped from the field, leaving the 4 knights dead upon the ground. The heart of Robert Bruce within its casket was found still chained about the neck of Douglas, and, according to the tradition of the Cathcart family, was taken up by Sir Alan Cathcart. The body of Douglas was brought to his cousin, Sir William Keith, who had been prevented from taking part in the battle by a broken arm. After having the body boiled so that the flesh parted from the bones, the flesh was buried in holy ground, and the bones placed on shipboard. Then Sir William Keith, in command of the remaining Scotsmen, sailed for home, and when they had made landfall, the heart of Bruce was carried to the Abbey of Melrose, and interred with great reverence, and the bones of Douglas were buried in the Kirk of Douglas. Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, the last of the great captains, had taken over the government of Scotland on the death of Bruce, as regent for the young king, David II. 3 years later he, too, was dead. Within 2 years of Randolph's death, Edward III disavowed the Treaty of Edinburgh on the grounds that he had been under age when he signed it. Warfare between England and Scotland began again, and continued intermittently for the next 400 years. The Scots suffered many defeats since their bravery was seldom equalled by their generalship, but never again was there the possibility of their becoming a subject race. Robert Bruce had forged a nation, and his victory at Bannockburn had given to his people a self-confidence which never deserted them, however serious their reverses. Scots wha he with Wallace bled, Scots whom Bruce had often led, welcome to your gory bed, or to victory.